Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became the ultimate survivor part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story is 𝐬𝐻 from 𝐽3. So let's start the video. Izuku was no stranger to heartbreak. The first time he experienced it was at the ripe age of 4. All because of some fucking toe joint. All he could do was sit on the stool dangling his little legs, staring up at his weeping mother. He wondered if there was anything he could do to prevent this, to prevent his mother from crying like this ever again, because of him, at the very least. He later found out he could never be a hero. Not now, and not ever. The quirkless were weak, fragile, they weren't meant to be heroes. They couldn't even protect themselves. Who are they to think they can save others if not themselves? Izuku's second heartbreak came not long after that fateful day. He woke up to thrashing from another room in the house. His parents, he thought. Izuku didn't have time to even think about how early in the morning it was before he heard voices. "Hasashi, please, please don't do this to me. Why are you leaving me?" His mother's voice was muffled through the door separating his room from the hallway. Izuku often found his mother in tears, though never this intense. He wondered what made her so upset. Izuku steadily inched himself out of bed, out from under the covers, creeping over the carpet-covered floor reaching for his creaky handle. Nonetheless, he thought better of it and leaned his right ear against the wood of his door instead. "I won't do it, _ɪᴏ. I refuse. I'm not gonna embarrass myself by being the father to some underdeveloped kid. You can do that shit on your own. I can't be bothered. Leave with me or not, I don't care. What's your choice?" Izuku expected to hear more arguing, his mother defending him, pleading, but he should have known better. He was instead met with silence. It was so loud yet quiet enough to hear a pin drop. Izuku didn't know what was going on. Why his mother had gone so silent, so he did what he thought was the best course of action at the moment, and started twisting his door handle open. His mother and father's room were directly across from him, only having to creak the door open an inch or two to see inside. With their door being wide open, Izuku wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe he expected his mother to be angry that Hasashi had even thought she'd leave her only child. Or maybe he was expecting her to feel betrayed by his words, that he'd leave her without a second thought. Instead, Izuku's mother was sitting on the edge of their bed, hands between her thighs, contemplating whether or not she should leave her 4-year-old son to fend for himself in the world. His father must have been getting impatient, because he suddenly sighed and turned back towards the dressers to continue packing his bags. Izuku directed his eyes back to his mother, curious as to what she was thinking about and what her decision would be. She murmured, barely above a broken whisper, so cautious that Izuku hadn't even noticed she'd been readying herself to reply. I can't, Hasashi. He's so young. I couldn't live with myself if I left him alone. Won't you stay, please?" When Hasashi had packed his bags, walking towards the entrance to their room, _ɪᴏ was quick to stumble off the bed and tail him, desperation leaking into her voice. "I don't. What did I do to deserve this? Choosing between the love of my life and my only child." They both passed by Izuku's door, Izuku himself being endlessly thankful they hadn't noticed the cracked door, or Izuku's fervent green eyes tracking their every move, darting across the expanse of the hall. Izuku could no longer see them, as they were now farther away, and Izuku wasn't brave enough to peek his head out to see. He decided he'd just need to depend on his sense of hearing. He heard more shuffling, his mother's pleading words unrelenting, blending into choking sobs. Throughout all of this, his father hadn't said a word, at least not until he was unlocking the front door. He heard his mother's sharp intake of air, surprised her husband was really leaving her to take care of their quirkless son alone. Izuku's head shot up, hearing hurried steps across the floor, his father's voice following, "Get off of me." Following what Izuku assumed to be his mother being thrown to the floor. He heard continuous sobbing, and then finally, for the last time, his father spoke to them. His cold tone felt like a whip across the child's back, leaving burning welts of painful memories seared into his mind. "I don't ever want to see you, or that quirkless piece of shit ever again." Izuku waited a few minutes after the door had shut to pull his door open just enough to step out, his heart hammering in his chest, breathing in as much air as possible through his nose to calm himself down. His mother's sobs had hushed, but were clearly far from done. He tiptoed down the hall with discretion, wincing when his foot landed on the creaky floorboard. He continued down the hall, turning towards the entry, to find his mother sitting, leaning against the front door with her head between her knees. Awkwardly shifted his weight onto either foot, not sure what to do with himself now that he was no longer in the comfort of his own room. He was about to take a step closer to his mom, when she suddenly lifted her head. Tear stains covered her face. her eyes agitated, bloodshot red like the tip of her nose, likely from rubbing the snot away with her sleeve. She was a sniffling, hiccuping mess, and Izuku had never seen his mother so distraught. He wanted to help her. He didn't like this. But Izuku really, truly looked at her. Under all those tears, under all this sadness and longing, was something else, something that Izuku wasn't expecting. Something he knew better than to not expect. Regret. So much regret. It was now all Izuku could see. No longer the sadness and longing, the worry for her child being raised alone. No, now all that was left was regret. And suddenly, Izuku understood what this regret was for. What it meant for her and what it meant about him. He knew what his mother was regretting. She was regretting him. She regretted birthing him, regretted his being quirkless, regretted choosing him. She regretted his whole being. With this realization, Izuku got on his hands and knees, crawling to his mother's side, his back to the door, leaning his head on her shoulder, and cried. Izuku had experienced heartbreak many more times after this, too many times to count, yet just enough times to question if these experiences were even considered heartbreak, wondering why it happened to him so often. It wasn't fair. Izuku had done his research. Normal people, quirked people don't experience heartbreak like this. So why was it happening to him? Izuku was convinced nobody could ever hurt him again, after experiencing everything that he's experienced. And trust when he says he's experienced it all. From fake confessions and waterboarding, to explosions going off in his face. That last one, though, was the usual. It became part of his routine. When Katsuki had found out about Izuku's condition, his failure to be more than just an untalented child. Even though it happened so often, Izuku wasn't particularly fond of the feeling of harsh heat in his face. So abrupt and intense. He couldn't smell the scent of burnt sugar anymore without thinking of explosions. Children laughing at him as he crumbled to the floor. Soft green locks turned to singed black tips. Izuku's everyday routine went something like this. Wake up, get ready, leave for school. Get harassed by Katsuki on the way to school because his house just so happened to be on the way there. Get to school, scrub his desk clean of any lingering death threat. Get through morning classes. Get harassed by Katsuki and his lackeys during lunch. Get through afternoon classes. Get harassed by Katsuki and his lackeys again after school. Go home, make dinner, do his homework, sleep, and repeat. It's a rarity whenever Izuku sees his mother. She'd taken to doing overtime whenever possible after Hisashi had left, choosing to get away from Izuku for as long as possible. Despite her distance, she cared enough to have left small amounts of money on the kitchen counter every Monday so he could take care of himself. Izuku didn't mind the silence. The quiet was a nice break from school. At school, he was Deku. At school, he had a persona he had to follow. But at home, he was just Izuku, the kid with dreams to become a big hero, the kid whose heart had been broken before he could understand the concept of heartbreak. Izuku, no longer Deku. Katsuki had taken to giving Izuku the nickname Deku when they were only 5. Izuku was still a little kid, naive, and didn't understand that Katsuki didn't want to be friends with a weird quirkless kid like him, so he did what little kids did and followed him everywhere. That day, it was the park. Izuku, Katsuki, and his group of friends had been sitting by the swings when Katsuki started flaunting the fact that he could read. Katsuki had started reading everyone's name off a piece of paper when he realized as he got to Izuku's name that it could be read different ways. Look, Katsuki gathered the attention of everyone. Izuku, did you know that your name could be read as Deku? Pronounced Deku, since you're so stupid. Katsuki had repeated himself, enunciating the word harshly. Do you know what it means, Deku? Of course you don't. It means useless. Fitting, isn't it? Perfect for a weak, useless, quirkless weirdo like you. Izuku could do nothing but laugh along awkwardly, suddenly feeling very out of place. Ever since then, nobody ever referred to Izuku by his real name now. Izuku was just Deku. He thinks this might have been when he realized that Katsuki was no longer his Kaken. Today has possibly been Izuku's worst heartbreak yet, a new record if you will. It was a Friday morning in the middle of June. It had started off simple, too simple to be true, luring him into a false sense of safety. He had slept through his alarm. Already he was running late to first period, which just so happened to be PE hastily getting ready and grabbing a water bottle and granola bar as a pathetic excuse for breakfast. He shoved his feet into the sloppily aligned red high tops and sprinted to school. Izuku had naturally become a quick runner after being chased home so many days. So he arrived only 5 minutes after the bell had rung, announcing the beginning of class. Unfortunately, those 5 minutes were 5 too many late for his PE teacher, Mr. Tanaka. As soon as Izuku stepped into the gym, Mr. Tanaka called out for him, "D Midoriya, you're late. What's your excuse?" Izuku opened his mouth to reply, to explain that he'd slept in, but Mr. Tanaka had interrupted him before he could even give a reply. "I don't want to hear your excuses." Izuku turned his mouth up at that. "Why ask if you didn't want to hear them?" He soured and his teacher continued. 20 laps around the gym. No stopping for water breaks or anything of the sort. If I see you slowing down, It's another 5 laps. Izuku didn't move at first, but was quick to throw his belongings onto the side and begin running when his teacher's voice rang out around the gym, screaming at him to get started. By the end of class, Izuku was dry heaving into a trash can, legs threatening to give out from under him. When he finally did manage to throw up, he made his way to his second period on trembling legs. It was right after lunch that Izuku's day plummeted further downhill. Izuku thought that Katsuki and his lackeys were giving him a break for the day, as he hadn't been bothered all of the lunch period. He should have known better. Izuku had his bag slung over his shoulder, head ducked down and shoulders tucked in as he walked through the halls. He walked like prey surrounded by predators. It took him a moment to realize that everybody was inching away from him, or making room for him. Izuku wasn't sure. He looked up to see everyone's eyes on him. To his left, to his right, in front of him, from the back, eyes everywhere. Izuku was pretty sure he even saw a phone or two pointed his way. What was going on? Why was everyone being so weird? Was there something on his face? Izuku hesitantly rubbed at his cheek to maybe rub off a smudge, when he heard a whisper yell from somewhere behind him. Now, Izuku had just enough time to turn his body in the direction the voice came from before one of Katsuki's lackeys ran up to him and pulled his pants down from his waist and down to his ankles. Izuku was too late. He tried backing up out of reach from the boy, but instead tripped over his feet and fell backwards onto the cold, hard floor. Izuku heard gasps from every which way, all in sync with each other, and suddenly realized the scars on his thighs were on full display. Izuku quickly reached down to his ankles, trying to pull his pants back up as quickly as he could, missing the first few times due to his hands shaking so violently. On the 4th try he finally got a good grip and tugged his pants back on while still sitting on the floor. He struggled to his hands and knees, using his hands to push himself back up into a standing position. Izuku finally turned his head up, finding everyone in the hall staring at him wide-eyed and jaws dropped, phones in hand. He couldn't find one student without a phone directed towards him. He looked around, eyes aimlessly searching, darting around to book it to an exit. He only found students blocking every door and path, practically flooding the halls. Just as Izuku was about to tough it out and push his way through the students to his left, the direction to his class, he saw a flash of blonde hair and red eyes. Katsuki was here. Katsuki watched him get publicly humiliated, and Izuku thought what Katsuki was doing was possibly worse than anyone else. Instead of recording like everyone else, Katsuki was just standing there, with his arms crossed over his chest and his eyebrow raised in question. Izuku knew exactly what that eyebrow meant. What are you gonna do about it? Do something. Izuku turned around and pushed through the crowd to his right, back the way he came, ignoring the phone cameras following him. Katsuki was right, even though he hadn't technically said anything. He'd implied it, and that's all that mattered. Izuku wouldn't do anything. So instead, Izuku skipped next period and hid in a bathroom stall, fighting away an impending panic attack. Finally, last period had arrived, not any sooner than usual. Last period was English, and nobody really paid much attention in English due to the teacher being an alcoholic whose hangovers lasted an entire day, so everybody was on their phones waiting for the bell to ring. This was fine with Izuku, because fortunately, he had taken to learning English whenever he was bored and had nothing better to do with the house always empty. He likes to think he's pretty fluent, so he doesn't really need an English class anyways. Unfortunately, since everyone was on their phones, he could also hear the video from earlier being played from every other phone. And whoever didn't get a video because they weren't in the hall at the moment was leaning over another student to catch a peek. One of the students next to Izuku had gotten a video. He watched the video from the corner of his eye, anxiously waiting to see himself be pantsed in front of half his school. Inevitably, the part came, and Izuku cringed when he saw his own scars on video, his body marred in indescribable ways. The student with the phone in her hand seemed to have focused on the scars as well, because she cringed with him. Her grimace was much meaner though. Izuku hated his scars. They were a stupid mistake, and he regrets it every day. He had been so young and so sad, so tired of being mistreated every day. He had missed the days where his father would push him on the swings in their favorite playground, and so he took his sadness out on himself. It helped him feel in control, unlike every other aspect of his life. He had control over this, not his mother, not Katsuki, not anybody. He didn't understand at the time that scars were permanent. Izuku soon realized that this did nothing to help in the long run. It helped in the moment, but it wasn't worth it. It wasn't really helping, so he stopped. But his scars are an ugly reminder to himself every day that everyone is right. His classmates, his father, his mother, the world. Kaken. His scars are proof that he's weak. That's all he really is, Deku. Izuku is startled out of his thoughts by the bell signaling the end of the day ringing, and is quick to shove his belongings into his bag and run through the doors and straight home. Or, that's what he would have done if he hadn't been tugged back into the room by the strap at the top of his bag. Very quickly, the class files out, while Katsuki's posse stayed behind, making sure that the door behind everyone had shut, leaving just Izuku, Katsuki, and his group. Izuku then hears quiet tutting behind him and turns on his heel, coming face to face with Katsuki. Katsuki huffed amusingly, tilting his chin up at Izuku. Still doing that weird stock Y thing with your weird hero notebooks? Huh. Izuku had been confused as to what he was referencing, when he suddenly realized he had subconsciously tucked his notebook under his arm instead of shoving it in his bag alongside the rest of his things. Katsuki decides to take this chance to snatch Izuku's hero analysis notebook from him. Izuku decided against moving to grab it back, knowing nothing good would have came from this decision, so he instead waited hesitantly while Katsuki flipped through the notebook. Katsuki didn't spare a second to actually read any pages, instead aimlessly sliding his thumb across them to turn them quicker, more so skimming than actually reading. He continued with pseudo-interest, exaggerating his facial features. Izuku fought the urge to roll his eyes. Izuku flinched when Katsuki slammed the notebook shut in his hands with a semi-loud explosion. You'd think that after being taught the same lesson over and over again, you'd finally learn, right? I guess not. A smug grin encapsulates his face. He took slow, steady steps towards Izuku, attempting intimidation. You see, Deku, us normal people, with quirks, are burdened by having to deal with your shit every day, you know. Katsuki finally reached Izuku, placing his left hand on Izuku's right shoulder, squeezing slightly too tight. Katsuki continued, you should be grateful, honestly, that we all take the time out of our day to help you understand how utterly meaningless you are to our society. Do you see what I'm getting at here, Deku? Katsuki slowly began leading Izuku to the open window on the other side of the room, side by side. Izuku was shaking at this point. All he wanted was to get his notebook back and get the hell out of here. Katsuki, on the other hand, wasn't done. You have how many of these notebooks now? Doesn't matter. A shit ton of notebooks about heroes and their quirks. Katsuki and Izuku approached the window, Katsuki holding the notebook in front of him, and yet you're still not understanding that quirks are everything. Have you ever heard of a quirkless hero? Because I sure as hell haven't. Katsuki then held the notebook up to Izuku. You see this? This is worthless. And with that, Katsuki tossed Izuku's hero analysis, number 13, out the window, into the fountain below. Izuku could feel his breath get caught in his throat. If you want to be a hero so badly, I know a real quick way of getting there. Izuku tensed. He could hear the snickers of Katsuki's lackeys behind him. Pray that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life, and take a swan dive off a roof. This was the last thing Izuku heard before Katsuki's seemingly most intense explosion went off on Izuku's shoulder. Instantly, the pain overtook all other senses, and he gasped as he fell to his knees, his hand still on the windowsill above him. His brain sent electrifying signals across his body, begging for release from the blinding pain. He thinks he might have heard Katsuki and his lackeys chuckling as they exited the room, but he's not sure. He wasn't sure of anything that happened following that, considering all he could hear was incessant ringing in his ears and torturous pain from his shoulder. Izuku wasn't sure how much time passed after that. Likely not long, with scattered amounts of students roamed the halls, but long enough. Izuku got up from his place below the window, using his hands that were supporting his weight on the windowsill to pull himself back up. His fingers flexed and tensed as they pulled him up, body protesting at the sudden movement. Izuku made his way out of the building. He didn't bother cleaning his wound at school, as he knew it would be fruitless because it had scarred. He also hadn't restocked his first aid kit since last week. He just hasn't had enough money to buy much. Before heading home, Izuku found his way to the fountain, dipping his hand into the water and reaching for his book. He shook it lightly, careful to avoid tearing the pages out, allowing water to begin dripping out of the soaking pages before taking a detour home. This time, he'd be taking the long way. He definitely didn't want to bump into Katsuki again. Izuku kind of felt like he was floating, like the world was moving around him. But Izuku was stuck in a small bubble, seeing everything in slow motion, when really, he's the one in slow motion and everything is moving at the right pace. In moments like these, it's best for Izuku to listen to some music and tune out the world around him. Izuku very carefully pulls his earbuds from his back pocket on his right side, trying not to move his right shoulder too roughly, steadily untangling them and putting them on. Izuku ended up settling on a more melancholic song, Be Quiet and Drive by Deftones, and continuing on his way home. The long way to Izuku's house required going through an underpass, and since he'd gone this way so many times after school, he didn't really think twice before walking through, earbuds still blasting. Unfortunately, he was so lost in his own head and unaware of his surroundings that he didn't realize what was awaiting him. Izuku usually had better spatial awareness, but not when he was floating like this. Sometimes when Izuku is floating, time flies away like a rug pulled beneath his feet, and he's left to pick the pieces of himself back up. He goes from one place to another without knowing how he'd gotten there. But Izuku was still floating, mind and body detached. With his sluggish moments, he hadn't noticed the presence behind him before being encased by sludge. Izuku immediately dug his hands out from his pockets, frantically trying to push the sludge away from his mouth, to no avail. He couldn't breathe. Izuku took a deep breath in, and instead got a mouthful of this mysterious goo. He couldn't cough. He couldn't breathe. He was trying so hard. Why couldn't he breathe? His lungs burned for air. Any attempt at breathing inhaled this substance through whatever orifice he attempted it with. Flailing, chest heaving hard as he could taste the sting of bile in his throat, hot tears prickling the corners of his eyes, getting lost into the sludge. He was going to die here. Was trying pointless. He couldn't grip onto anything. Maybe it was for the better. If he died here, at least now it could be reported as a freak accident. If he even got reported at that. Who is he kidding? Nobody cares about some quirkless kid dying. He brought nothing to the world like the useless thing he was. Just as Izuku accepted his fate and began to shut his eyes, he heard muffled monologuing from somewhere around him. "It's all right now, young man. I am here." Izuku was losing his mind. That couldn't possibly be who he thought it was. Right, maybe the lack of oxygen made him delusional? Definitely. Texas smash. At the same time those words were spoken, Izuku felt something roughly grab his wrist, before a particularly massive amount of wind blew the sludge villain away from Izuku's body. Izuku immediately fell to his knees, using his hands to prevent himself from collapsing completely like a rag doll. He coughed first, in large portions of sludge, before puking onto the road. After he was sure he was done, since he was pretty sure he didn't even have the energy to stand up, he rolled over on his back and laid there with his eyes closed, until he felt slapping on his cheeks. Hey, yo, thank goodness. Izuku blearily cracked open his eyes as the wind pulled all water away from him, before shooting them open. Holy shit, he just got saved by All Might. The All Might. Izuku opened his mouth to thank him, but found that he couldn't process any words due to shock. His notebook. He frantically looked around for his notebook, hoping to get an autograph from All Might. God, he was so excited. Maybe he could ask All Might a question on the way to the police station. The question. Izuku finally found his notebook lying near him, but when he went to open up the most recently blank page, he found that All Might had already signed it. He turned back around to face All Might in shock, and found All Might stuffing bottles into his pants pocket. The sludge villain. Probably. All Might then turned his focus back to Izuku. You're fine, right? I'm running a bit low on time, so I've got to get out of here and get this guy to the police, you understand? With that, All Might started stretching, readying himself to leave Izuku alone once again. See you on the other side of the screen. Wait, All Might couldn't leave yet. He hadn't even made sure Izuku was okay. Izuku desperately urged his legs to move from under him, but he was too wobbly to stand without falling. He stumbled towards All Might, grabbing onto his pants leg to hopefully keep balance. The last thing he expected was to suddenly be hundreds of feet in the air. He gripped as hard as he could onto All Might's leg with both hands, trying hard not to scream. All Might seemed to have noticed rather quickly that he wasn't alone. Hey, what are you doing? Let go. Izuku ducked his head into All Might's leg to keep the wind away from his face, even though it'd muffle his voice. I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask a question. I can't let go now, I'll die. All Might seemed to ponder this, and realize Izuku was absolutely right. Izuku felt All Might grab onto his backpack to keep him close, coughing at the same time. Aw, shit. Just hold on tight. All Might had landed the two of them on an abandoned building in the middle of a run-down town. Izuku's not sure why exactly, but he thinks the blood trailing down All Might's chin might have something to do with that. As soon as they had landed, All Might pried Izuku's hands off his leg as quick as possible, quick to call out that he must leave, and to leave down the roof entrance. Izuku was quick to yell out his pleas. This couldn't all have been for nothing. He needed to ask All Might his question. Izuku thinks that if All Might gives him the answer he wants, he might just be able to make it in life. Wait, please. I have a question. Please don't leave. Izuku tried his hardest to get All Might to stay, but he wouldn't budge. All Might continued walk towards the edge of the roof, as if he hadn't even heard Izuku at all. Finally, Izuku decided he would just ask anyways. What harm would it do? At least All Might will have heard the question. Then he'll have to answer, right? Even if I don't have a quirk, do you think I could be a hero? Izuku shut his eyes, hoping for the best. He waited for All Might's reply, but nothing. There was nothing. Izuku hesitantly opened his eyes, expecting All Might to be gone, and was instead met with the sight of a scrawny old man in front of him. Izuku let out a shocked heap, and stumbled backwards, falling due to his legs still trembling. Except, this wasn't just some scrawny old man, right? This had to be. It had to be All Might, right? Nobody else was on the roof, and if Izuku looked close enough, the man resembled All Might. Not to mention the fact he was drowning in the All Might suit. Hesitantly, Izuku whispered, just loud enough for the man to hear, All Might. All Might continued on after this to explain his appearance. Apparently, he had been in some crazy insane fight that left him with a serious injury on his side. Izuku thinks he remembers this fight, remembers watching the videos when he was younger and thinking, wow, All Might is so cool. I want to be like him when I'm older. And now look at where that's gotten him. After All Might finished his explanation, he finally decided to answer Izuku's question, since there was no reason to be in such a rush to leave anymore. To answer your question, young man, no, you cannot become a hero without a quirk. Izuku froze. Of fucking course he should have expected this. What did he think would happen? All Might would start yelling his praises, telling him to never give up on his dreams. Yeah, right. This was proof. Proof that Izuku couldn't prove anyone wrong, because they were right. If the literal symbol of peace was saying it, there was no way for Izuku to continue chasing pointless dreams. All Might continued, if you really want to help people, you could try being a cop. They help lots of people. Best of luck, young man. Izuku didn't move. He didn't move while All Might transformed back into his hero form. He didn't move after All Might left. He didn't move for a while. Izuku sat there thinking about what an idiot he'd been to think that the #1 hero would believe a quirkless kid could be a hero. Izuku was upset with himself for even thinking that he himself could be a hero. He hadn't even put any effort into it. He's as thin as a stick, no muscle in sight, and all he does is analyze. And where will that get him in the future? Nowhere. Izuku jerked up when he heard the sound of explosions coming from the distance. A hero fight, maybe. He clutched his notebook to his hand and raced to the fence along the edge of the building. He tucked his notebook under his armpit and gripped the fence with his fingers, searching for the source of the explosion. Sure enough, far out from where he's standing, there were blinding explosions being released. And Izuku knew these explosions. They weren't just any explosions. They were Katsuki's. He's sure of it. Izuku's conscience immediately imagined the worst. Katsuki being in trouble and not being saved. Although the thought was impractical considering how noisy the explosions were, Izuku couldn't help but think that he needed to be there for Katsuki in case he were in trouble. Izuku swiftly backed away from the fence, tripping over his own feet in a hurry to get to the roof access door. When he finally made it to the door, he harshly grasped the handle, twisting it down and pulling. It didn't budge. Izuku tried again, letting go of the handle, grabbing it again, twisting, pulling. Nothing. Maybe it was push and not pull. Izuku tried once more, ignoring the sound of his heartbeat in his ears speeding up. He twisted and pushed. Fucking nothing. He frantically started banging on the door as hard as he could, realizing that the door wasn't budging. Of fucking course the abandoned building had a broken roof access door. This couldn't be happening to Izuku. It just couldn't. Izuku tried one more time, tears clouding his vision, explosions getting louder in the distance. He threw his notebook to the floor, placed his right foot next to the door, and pulled as hard as he could. This time, something did happen. Izuku fell backwards onto the floor for the 3rd time that day, with the door handle still in his hands, definitely no longer on the door. Izuku could no longer hear anything over the pounding of his heart threatening to beat out of his chest. He raised his eyes back from his hands to the door, to find the door still shut. Izuku was completely and utterly fucked. Izuku stood leaning against the door for a few moments, taking in the situation. He was essentially stuck on the roof of a very abandoned, deserted area with no exit in sight. Eventually, he realized he couldn't just sit there expecting to be saved, so he got up, leaving his belongings on the floor. Izuku made his way over to the fence, leaned over the edge, and screamed as loud as he could. He figured screaming was the best way to gain attraction, so he continued screaming for as long as his vocal cords allowed him, no more than a measly 10 minutes. He expected the commotion to work, and when he found that nobody seemed to have heard him, he started panicking. The situation suddenly seemed a whole lot more serious, and Izuku wasn't sure he could deal with this. Honestly, who could? Izuku pursed his lips, looking around for something, anything, that would help him. When he couldn't find anything, he started pacing around the roof. There's got to be a way out that he's not seeing. Something he's missing. Something that slipped from his mind. Maybe he could just climb down. No, he'd definitely fall. He could throw his backpack down and hope somebody hears. Or sees. Nope, stupid. There's no guarantee that anyone would notice, and then he'd be in even deeper shit because his bag holds all his valuables, and currently, the only money he has. Fuck, there's really no way out of this, huh? Wait, the fire escapes. Every building has a fire escape, deserted or not. With a pep in his step, Izuku speed walked to the edge of the fence, looking over it. Nothing yet, so Izuku followed the fence around the edge of the building, peeking over each side. Finally, he made it to the last side, and found the fire escape. The fire escape that was crumbling apart. Perfect. Izuku cursed under his breath, his voice breaking at the end. Back to square one. Izuku paced around the roof once more, conjuring up some plans in his head. Soon, Izuku found a rock lying in a corner and got his hopes up. Maybe he could use this rock to get someone's attention. He ran back over to the fence, searching for anyone in sight. It took a solid half-hour before Izuku caught sight of anyone. He hopefully took a deep breath and held it, not letting himself get too worked up. He didn't want to miss this lucky chance. He rolled the rock in his hand, testing its weight, feeling how far it would reach. He ultimately decided it would probably reach the man if he threw it hard enough. Izuku wound up his arm, taking aim, sticking out the tip of his tongue in concentration. He finally threw the rock, not wanting to lose his chance. He watched as the rock flew through the air, getting closer and closer to his target. Izuku practically jumped up and down when the rock landed right in front of the man, and he silently thanked whatever gods there were for his amazing aim. Izuku expected the man to question where the rock came from, inevitably looking around in the direction it came from, and finally finding Izuku. Except, the man ignored it and kept walking. No, why was he ignoring it? It's not every day a rock falls out of the sky. Izuku watched the man closer, ultimately realizing that he hadn't ignored the rock, he just hadn't noticed. He had headphones on and a phone in his hand. Of course he didn't notice, just Izuku's luck. Belatedly, Izuku finally let the tears fall. Assuming his place back against the door, Izuku held his head between his knees, arms wrapping around himself as he slid to the floor. Izuku's sobs were quiet enough that if someone were on the other side of the roof, they wouldn't hear him. Izuku refused to give up hope. Surely, someone would eventually notice that he's missing, right? Spending so much time isolated on a roof in the middle of nowhere gave Izuku time to think. His phone died somewhere at the 8-hour mark, so he's not sure exactly how long he's been stranded, but long enough. His first realization was that nobody was likely looking for him. He can't imagine why anyone would. First off, his mother is never home, she wouldn't immediately notice. Second, it's Friday, so he doesn't need to show up for school. The most he could possibly wish for is that his mother came home for the weekend. But that's unlikely. Izuku thought a lot on a daily basis, so when he was stuck somewhere, completely alone, he thought that much more, and blamed that much more. Fucking All Might. Never did he think he'd turn his nose up at the thought of All Might. But there's a first for everything. Does he even think? He's probably brain damaged from that fight that left him crippled. Or maybe old age is getting to him. First, he leaves some middle schooler on the side of the street after being attacked by a villain. Then he tells said middle schooler to give up on his dreams right after. What the fuck? Not to mention telling his whole life story and secrets worth $1 million to that exact same middle schooler. What an idiot. Does he have no sense of self-preservation? Izuku could give that information to whoever and whatever he wanted. Not that he would. Probably. He doesn't even know who he'd tell, considering he's still stuck on this roof. Izuku thinks that maybe, if he ever gets off this roof, he'll tell the whole world it was All Might's fault. The real question is if anyone would care. Izuku thought he ran out of tears a while ago, but he was wrong. He missed his mom. He missed 𝐀𝐦 for fuck's sake. He just wanted to go home. His stomach was cramping like crazy, and Izuku was in pain, so much pain he couldn't even muster up the energy to stand. He started counting the minutes exactly 12 hours and 16 minutes ago. He's been keeping track in his notebook. He's afraid that if he sleeps, perhaps he'll miss a helicopter overhead looking for him. Not that it's happened yet, or that it would happen. He's been sitting in the same position for so long that his whole body is aching now, but he doesn't care. All he cares about right now is home. He wants to go home, even if home is empty and unloving, just him and the allowance on the table every morning. He swears he'll never take advantage of what he has ever again. It's Monday now. He's sure of it, and Izuku has made his decision. He knows without question now that he'll never be saved. All Might probably hasn't even thought of him since Friday. And so, Izuku's going to speed up the process. He can't go through this torture for any longer. With his mind made up, Izuku untucks himself, unlocking his hands from around his knees and onto the floor of either side of him. Immediately he hears at least 4 bones pop. Nice. With what little strength left he has, he pushes himself up from the palms of his hands, chin tucked. His legs crack in protest as he rises. Then his back follows when he stretches it out. He's sure he looks like shit right now, with dried tear stains all over his face, no doubt. Izuku scopes out the roof slowly, searching for the part of the fence he's sure had a tear in it. Found it. He turns to his right, nearing the tear in the fence. When he reaches it, he pauses. How exactly is he going to do this? The tear is big, yeah, but not big enough for him to squeeze through. He could probably pull it, and it'd break off altogether, if he even has enough strength for that. Worth a try. Izuku wipes his fingers against his pants before he grabs one edge of the tear with both hands. He thinks if he can pull it to the right enough, it'll completely snap off. Yeah, he can do this. Izuku does a test tug first, examining how sturdy it is, and luckily, it isn't. With newfound determination, Izuku pulls at the fence with all his strength. He can feel the fence giving out, so he pulls harder, as hard as he could. Finally, the fence gives out with a very loud rattle, and Izuku falls backward, with the fence still in his hands. He could cry of joy. He'll finally be free. Izuku is quick to throw the fence to the side. and he crawls near the edge instead of standing up. He needs to wait for his energy to recharge before he can stand on his own. Scratch that, he lied. He wants to get this over with as soon as possible. So he threads his fingers through the holes of the untouched fence and pulls all his weight up. A gust of lukewarm wind makes his dirty hair shift as he looms over the edge. Izuku almost can't believe this is how he's gonna go out. In such a pathetic way. He wishes he could say he never thought it'd end like this, but he'd be lying. He'd thought about it before, many times, actually, taking his life to cleanse himself of all his problems. It'd be so nice. He just knows it, and he can picture it right now. The thrill of leaning backwards, finally stepping off the edge, and just falling. It'd be so peaceful, the wind whipping harshly around him, his last living sensation. And then finally he'd hit the floor, and it'd all be over. No more worrying about how much money his mom would leave him on Monday morning. No more worrying about how torturous the next day would be. No more worrying about avoiding Katsuki. It'd just all be over. Maybe, if he was lucky, Katsuki would be right, and he'd be reborn with a quirk. Ah, how refreshing that'd be. To be normal. Izuku shook his head, ridding himself of those thoughts. What good will it do him if he doesn't actually act out on them? Might as well hurry it up. Izuku inhaled deeply and stretched his limbs out like a star, still clinging onto the fence. Sue him, he couldn't steadily stand up without support right now. He wasn't exactly sure how high up he was right now, so he decided he'd take a peek to prepare himself, and to make sure he'd actually die from the fall. It'd suck if he'd have to die from bleeding out instead of dying on impact. Izuku clutched on a little tighter and then looked down, hoping to be at least 8 stories up. What he didn't expect when he looked down was to find someone staring directly at him. What the fuck? Izuku sucked in a sharp breath, gripping onto the fence even harder, so hard he could feel the edges piercing his skin. How long had he been there? That's creepy as hell. Izuku intensely studied the figure, though it was a bit difficult with how far up he was. Izuku figured that from what he could see. He was about 10 stories high right now. It was a man. He had black hair, and was leaning against the building across from Izuku, with his right ankle crossed over the other. He had his arm around his torso, and his left hand holding an ash-covered cigarette, slowly burning into a stub to his mouth. He also had scars, a lot at that. From what Izuku could see, most of the skin that wasn't being covered by clothing had scars. The two of them continued their staring contest until the scarred man took a drag from his cigarette, folding his arms over his chest. The man then cupped his hands around his mouth, yelling just loud enough for Izuku to hear. "You're only proving others right by killing yourself." Izuku blinked. "What?" The man continued. "If you're gonna do this, at least find a cooler way." He then uncupped his hands, taking another drag of his smoldering cigarette, letting smoke lazily pour out of his mouth. Izuku was so stunned that he stepped away from the edge. Suddenly, being 10 stories up sounds a lot more scary than it did a minute ago. Hastily, he got on his hands and knees and inched back to the edge, peering over with just his eyes and nose visible, his green, now matted and dirty curls obscuring his vision. The man didn't bother cupping his hands around his mouth again, instead just yelling up to Izuku, "You coming down or what?" Izuku just blinked down at him again, expecting something to happen. Then he realized the man was addressing him. Izuku opened his mouth to yell back, before he registered that it's been over 2 days since he's spoken. He cleared his throat to the best of his abilities and reached for his voice. "I'm stuck. The door's locked." The words came out hoarse, but luckily loud enough for the scarred man below him to hear. Izuku was thankful that the area he was stuck in was quiet enough for that to be possible. The man held up one finger signaling Izuku to wait, before tossing his cigarette onto the floor and crushing it beneath his boot. He then trekked his way up to the front door of the building, disappearing into it. Izuku could have cried. Actually, he's pretty sure he can feel the tears starting up. He swiftly threw his head back, willing the tears to go away. He didn't want to embarrass himself in front of his savior. Izuku suddenly remembered how close he was to the edge. Thunderstruck, he shoved himself backwards with the palm of his hands, his feet frantically pushing away from himself. This rush of clarity left him racked with regret. What was he thinking? He didn't want to die. He never did. The man was right. The only thing he'd be doing is proving everyone right. After a minute or so, though it felt like eternity, Izuku could hear the sound of footsteps nearing the roof access door, along with heavy breathing. Finally, Izuku darted to the door, his feet slipping under him, struggling to keep his balance. He put his ear to the door, listening to the man's footsteps getting closer and closer. When he was sure the man was right behind the door, he backed away, not wanting to get hit by the door whenever it opened. Still trembling, Izuku watched as the door handle shook rapidly. Is he serious? Izuku just told him it was locked. The man then decided the handle obviously wasn't working, because the rattling ceased. Izuku swears he jumped 5 feet into the air when something very roughly crashed into the door, shaking the hinges. The door didn't budge. Behind the door, Izuku heard a rumbling voice, one he couldn't recognize. "Fuck, oh." Izuku's eyebrows flew up to his hairline. Hearing a voice after so long made this seem just that much more real. Which, he supposes, makes sense since this is real. He then heard the sound footsteps backing up, followed by the man's voice again. I don't know how close you are to the door, but you might want to back the fuck up. Izuku immediately complied, maybe a little too hastily, because he started toppling backwards, trying to avoid falling. He leaned his body weight forward in hopes of centering himself. This didn't work, and he instead fell forward onto his knees. All of a sudden, the door literally flew open, and Izuku caught sight of his savior. He was fascinated by his scars. They were beautiful, a deep purple shade, a kind he hadn't seen before. Burned scars, maybe. Were they being held together by? What even is that? Staring isn't very nice. Izuku flushed, realizing he'd been caught. A smug grin crossed the man's face before he began scoping out the roof. Ignoring Izuku, the man headed towards Izuku's bag and placed his notebook inside for him, then zipped it up. Who even was this? Slinging his bag over his shoulder, the man walked back to the roof entrance and leaned down to examine the lock. He must have found what he was looking for, because he muttered out loud, "It wasn't locked, it was jammed." He tossed Izuku a glance. "Shit luck, huh?" He snorted sarcastically. Izuku just stared, not sure if that was a rhetorical question or not. He watched as the man awkwardly scratched behind his ear, finally speaking again. "Can you walk?" Izuku shook his head no, still at a loss for words. The man across from him huffed, all the while removing Izuku's bag from his back, instead putting one arm through each hole and holding it in front of him. Izuku's heart rate picked up in speed when the man walked closer to him, suddenly turning around and squatting. Izuku faltered, wondering what exactly he was doing, until the man griped as if it was obvious from the start. "Well, are you gonna get on?" Izuku whispered out a soft "oh" and moved to get on the man's back, crossing his arms over his neck. The man stood up, grunting out a soft "upsie-daisy," courtesy of the added weight on his back. The man adjusted Izuku on his back, shuffling until he was more comfortable with the weight resting on him. Resting his chin against the man's shoulder, Izuku jostled lightly with each step he took. The man didn't bother closing the door behind him before carefully descending down the staircase. The pair hadn't even made it down 2 flights of stairs before Izuku decided the silence was a little too heavy for him. Clearing his throat once more, Izuku asked aloud, "So, what's your name? Might as well get introductions out of the way, right? It'd be pretty awkward to talk to someone if you didn't know what to call them." Mystery Man didn't answer instantly, instead leaving Izuku in the dark. "Fine," Izuku grumbled to himself. The uncomfortable silence continued up until they reached the 4th flight down. Mystery Man finally let up his vow of silence, declaring his name, 𝗫𝗿. He voiced, not bothering to elaborate. Izuku beamed to himself, knowing he'd won. Izuku adjusted his arms around Mystery Man, 𝗫𝗿's neck before responding with a fascinated "oh." 𝗫𝗿 hummed out in acknowledgement, completely done with the conversation, though Izuku was not. Izuku snook a quick glance out of a well-rusted window to discern how close they were to ground level, before resuming the conversation. 𝗫𝗿. He sounded out, "That's a cool name." Izuku paused, debating. Instantaneously, he continued, "Is it your birth name? Doesn't that translate directly into cremation?" 𝗫𝗿 opened his mouth to reply, before promptly shutting his mouth, thinking twice before answering. Subsequently, 𝗫𝗿 finished thinking, answering with a slight attitude. "What's it to you?" Izuku's heart dropped to his stomach. His eyes widened, realizing that he likely just asked an inappropriate question. "Sorry, you don't have to answer that. I was just curious." Izuku frowned. He'd somehow already fucked up introductions with the guy who just saved him not even 5 minutes ago. From the corner of his eye, Izuku spotted 𝗫𝗿's eyebrow lift, intrigued. 𝗫𝗿 then huffed, shaking his head amazingly. Without prompting, 𝗫𝗿 resumed the conversation. "So," 𝗫𝗿 subtly glanced back to Izuku, "how exactly did you get up there? Get pushed out of a helicopter or something?" Although obviously sarcastic, Izuku could hear the twinge of genuine curiosity lingering underneath his chuckling remark. Not wanting to bother 𝗫𝗿 with the messy details of heroism and failure, Izuku hesitantly chuckled. "Or something like that. It's a bit of a long story." He didn't exactly plan to tell 𝗫𝗿 exactly what happened. He wouldn't be able to tell the story without including All Might, as the story would make absolutely no sense otherwise. He figured it wasn't his place to lay out All Might's personal matters to random strangers either. "I'm sure it is. I've got the time, if you do." Oh, who was Izuku kidding? All Might was more of a stranger than 𝗫𝗿, if anything. Why should Izuku have to carry the burden of All Might's secrets all by himself when he didn't even ask to know them? Maybe he should be more careful of who he tells his secrets to. What happens with this nifty piece of information has nothing to do with Izuku. Determining that he'd humor 𝗫𝗿, Izuku was off. Surprisingly, or maybe unsurprisingly, venting to 𝗫𝗿 helped a lot. Throughout the very one-sided conversation, 𝗫𝗿 let out little HMMs and really S of acknowledgement, letting Izuku know he was still listening. When Izuku was officially tired out, he sighed complacently, resting his cheek against 𝗵𝗲's right shoulder, and then shot his head up when he noticed that they definitely weren't in the building anymore. As a matter of fact, they seemed to be in an entirely different part of town. Had he really been so in his own world he hadn't even taken in his surroundings? Izuku places his hands on 𝗵𝗲's shoulder lightly, leaning over his own shoulder, wondering if he could spot the building from where they were. Nothing. Curiously, Izuku pulled his eyebrows together, wondering where exactly he was being taken. He's not being kidnapped, is he? It wouldn't be hard if he were. He couldn't fight off an angry rooster right now if he wanted to. Your stomach growled at least 9 times during that whole storytelling. We're going to get something to eat. Damn, he didn't mean to say that out loud. At the mention of food, Izuku's stomach growled again, stretching out for an honest and long 7 seconds, at least. Embarrassed, Izuku chuckled, apologizing softly on behalf of his stomach. He hadn't even realized how hungry he was until now, in all honesty, but now that he had realized, it was over for him. Luckily, 𝗵𝗲 wasn't bothered, and continued on their walk to wherever they were going. They arrived not much later. 𝗵𝗲 had taken Izuku to a small family-run diner, he thinks, with a multitude of cute little 2-seater tables decorating the front. Only a few of them were filled, the one closest to Izuku and 𝗵𝗲 being occupied by a son and his mother. Izuku watched the two as they passed by, the little boy swinging his legs under his seat with animated excitement, rambling on about some hero or another. Between bated breaths, the mother spoon-fed him, and then he went on and on. Izuku shifted uncomfortably with his eyes in avoidance. The unwanted memories dripped into his mind like a bitter coffee, and Izuku didn't enjoy the aftertaste. Kicking the door open as casually as he could, the little bell above them ringing, 𝗵𝗲 strolled up to the front counter. Izuku gaped at the scene before him. The diner was cute. Like, really cute. It had a sweet retro vibe to it, everything colored a vibrant pink and blue, with glowing neon signs sprinkled along the walls. One in particular stood out to him, a pink one, spelling out the words "You can do it" in cursive. At the front counter, menus were lined up neatly on either side, and a little bell sitting on the right of Izuku. Behind the counter sat a young girl, maybe a year or so older than Izuku, reading a particularly thick book. Izuku tried to take a peek over 𝗵𝗲's shoulder to catch the title, with no such luck. 𝗵𝗲 then cleared his throat, gaining the attention of the girl. Her name tag read "I" in the same cursive as the "You can do it" from before. She quickly shoved a bookmark into the page she left on, fixing her posture all the while. My bad. Just the 2 of you. Izuku flushed at the puzzled look on her face. He's sure he doesn't look very good right now. Ducking his face into 𝗵𝗲's shoulder, he felt 𝗵𝗲's head nod in answer to "I." Once sat at the table, 𝗳 departs, shouting out a quick "I'll be back for your orders in a minute." 𝗵𝗲 wasted no time when picking up the menu in front of him, eyeing the options available. Instead of picking up the only other menu, Izuku picked at his fingernails, absent-mindedly biting his lower lip. So, I take it you're not a big All Might fan, huh? 𝗵𝗲 was still scanning the menu, so Izuku wasn't completely sure he wasn't hearing things. After deciding he definitely wasn't going crazy, he pondered the question. How was he supposed to answer that? It's a bit more complicated than that. If you asked me just 3 days ago, I would have said something stupid like, Izuku added air quotes before continuing, of course. He's the greatest hero ever, putting others' lives before his own, keeping everyone out of trouble, no matter who they are. I hope I can be as selfless as him when I'm a hero one day. But, as you've probably guessed, I'm not. The fondest of him as of currently. Izuku wilted as he said that. It wasn't the most pleasant realization, but a realization nonetheless. All Might wasn't who he thought he was, who he wanted him to be, who he needed him to be. If All Might wouldn't save someone like Izuku, who would? Right. So, just to recap, you're quirkless? Must be rough, huh? Is that where that burn on your shoulder came from? Izuku frowned, not hesitating to cover his shoulder with the palm of his hand, which turned out to be the worst possible decision, wincing harshly immediately. He'd completely forgotten about the burn, with the anguishing hunger overtaking all his other senses earlier. However, the pain in his shoulder was full-blown now, blending with the still agonizing hunger he's been feeling the past few days, lifting his hand just enough to let him see underneath. He grimaced slightly, covering the burn once more. It was nasty. It covered the entirety of his shoulder, practically splaying across his back. He couldn't tell how far down it went or where it started and ended from this angle. From what he could see, it was rather unsettling to look at. The burn was an amalgamation of pink and brown tones, with infection clearly starting to tear at the edges of the injury, especially his shoulder, which was red and raw from being in the direct blast radius. Izuku didn't dare overexert his body by turning to look at it any more than he already had. It made him writhe in pain enough, and he didn't need to pull on the already burnt skin just to see more. Izuku scowled at the memory of Katsuki, removing his hand from his shoulder, instead propping his elbow on the table, resting his chin on his palm. Before Izuku got the chance to reply to 𝗵𝗲, Aya came back, notepad and pen at the ready. Apologies for the wait. Can I get you started with a drink? Or are you ready to order? We're ready to order. All right, perfect. What can I get you? 𝗵𝗲 pointed at what he wanted, doing the same for his drink, before Aya faced Izuku expectantly. Shit, he hadn't thought past the idea of just getting food. Izuku had been so distracted he forgot to actually order something. He chuckled, fumbling to open his menu. Just as quickly as he picked up the menu, it had been swiped out from his hands. 𝗵𝗲 stacked Izuku's menu with his own, handing them both to Aya. He'll have the same thing I'm having, thank you. Aya bowed politely before taking her leave. Izuku hadn't even cared to guess what 𝗵𝗲 had ordered him before absolutely tearing into it. Some kind of sandwich, maybe? There was chicken somewhere in the mix. He could hear 𝗵𝗲 laughing at him from the other side of the table, but ultimately decided that food was much more important than 𝗵𝗲 and his taunting right now. Chewing thoroughly, he reached to his chocolate milkshake, another one also on 𝗵𝗲's side of the table. Disregarding the straw, he drank from the edge of the glass, not wanting to waste time. From across the table, 𝗵𝗲 picked up his sandwich with both hands, holding it in front of his mouth before taking a bite in favor of asking Izuku a question. So, I'm curious, how old are you, exactly? Deciding now was a good time to take a rather large bite of his sandwich, 𝗵𝗲 did just that, before continuing. I noticed you were wearing a school uniform. High school. What grade? Wait, let me guess. Second year. Izuku frowned at the food flying out of 𝗵𝗲's mouth as he spoke. Yug. Izuku finished chewing before replying. No. I'm 14. I'm in middle school. My last year, actually. Izuku was especially proud of that one. He couldn't count on all his fingers how many times he'd been told he wouldn't make it past his first year. Oh, how he'd like to shove it in everyone's faces. 𝗵𝗲 snorted from across the table. Izuku didn't find what he said to be especially funny. He shrugged, decidedly not questioning it. When 𝗵𝗲 noticed that Izuku wasn't laughing along with him, he looked up from his sandwich. Izuku stared back, obnoxiously shoving 5 fries into his mouth at once. 𝗵𝗲 blinked in disbelief, slamming his milkshake down onto the table, a splash of it falling over the edge onto the placemat. You're fucking with me, right? You can't possibly be serious. Shrugging his shoulders, Izuku shook his head. He hadn't had enough time to swallow his food to answer properly. 𝗵𝗲 huffed, taking a sip of his milkshake, before mumbling out what Izuku thought was, sure don't look it. That's interesting. Izuku doesn't really think he looks all that old. He has freckles coating every inch of his face, for fuck's sake. Chewing the end of his straw, Izuku wondered what 𝗵𝗲 was seeing. Huffing out a chuckle to himself, Izuku smirked around his straw. You think so? Is it my boyish charm? Izuku wiggled his eyebrows, blinking through his lashes. 𝗵𝗲 didn't seem to find this as amusing as Izuku did. Gross. Definitely don't do that again. So then what is it? I think I look my age. 𝗵𝗲's eyebrow quirked up in curiosity, putting his half-eaten fry down at the same time. Well, for one, you're tall. Not like freakishly tall, but definitely tall for your age. Haven't you noticed that? Izuku had not noticed that, actually. He hadn't been to a doctor to get his physical taken in years, so he never really knew how tall he was. He could have just bought a scale with the money his mother left him, but he didn't think that was as important as food. Now that he thinks about it, though, he is in the taller group of people at his school. He just always assumed that everyone else was short, not that he was tall. How tall do you think I am? Izuku hadn't a clue how tall he could be, but he had a feeling 𝗵𝗲 might be more accurate than he'd be. 𝗵𝗲 considered this for a moment, analyzing Izuku, trying to remember how tall Izuku had seemed to him when he set him down from his back to take a seat in the booth. I'd say a solid 172 centimeters. Thoroughly stunned, Izuku mulled the thought over. He wasn't sure how to feel about this, but he's pretty sure being tall has a few advantages. Anyways, second, your face is pretty slim. Normally at your age, you'd still have some baby fat. 𝗵𝗲 paused then, thinking. You know, now that I think about it, that's probably because you haven't eaten in almost 3 days. My bad. Conversation had faded out quickly after that, 𝗵𝗲 and Izuku similarly wanting to finish their food. Izuku had his head leaning on his palm, picking up his food with his right hand. Just as he was about to take the last bite of his sandwich, there was snapping in his face. Jerking up, Izuku stared at 𝗵𝗲, very confused. You back? Lost you for a bit there. Tired? Izuku hadn't fallen asleep. Yeah, you did. Look, you even drooled a bit. Damn, thought out loud again. Looking down at the placemat, sure enough, there was drool. He hurriedly plucked a napkin out of the dispenser, wiping down the placemat, even though they're paper and get thrown out after every use. Just as he was about to retort against 𝗵𝗲's accusation, Izuku was interrupted by a yawn. His own yawn. He hadn't even noticed he felt tired. Not wanting to admit 𝗵𝗲 was right, Izuku shoved the rest of his sandwich in his mouth. Izuku slurped on his straw as 𝗵𝗲 downed the rest of his milkshake in one gulp, wiping away the milk mustache that stained his mouth with the side of his thumb. You done yet? We should start heading out. 𝗵𝗲 rose from his seat, straightening out his clothing as he did. Izuku rushed to clean up his mess and joined 𝗵𝗲, not wanting to hold him up. He stumbled slightly, but didn't let it stop him. He'd have to start taking care of himself again eventually. He couldn't depend on 𝗵𝗲 too much now. Izuku rushed to keep up with 𝗵𝗲, who was already nearing the exit. Once he caught up, he realized they hadn't paid yet. Shouldn't we pay? Aya seemed nice. He'd feel bad for not even leaving her a tip. 𝗵𝗲, on the other hand, wasn't bothered in the slightest. He waved his hand dismissively, claiming that the owner owed him a favor, whatever that means. Izuku waved goodbye to Aya on the way out anyways. Currently, Izuku and 𝗵𝗲 were strolling through the aisles of a corner store. They'd only been walking for roughly a few minutes, albeit slowly, courtesy of Izuku, when 𝗵𝗲 abruptly turned into a store. Not risking losing the only person Izuku knows in this area, Izuku followed warily. The store was quite small, obviously a small business, and there were only about 5 people in the store. The aisles were small enough that only one person could walk through at once, so Izuku walked directly into 𝗵𝗲's back when he stopped walking. Hey, he was shut up by 𝗵𝗲 putting a finger to his lips. Izuku rolled his eyes faintly, before looking around at his surroundings. He examined the rows in front of him, each holding some medical treatment of the sort, ranging from band-aids to gauze. 𝗵𝗲 hurriedly began shoving a multitude of things wherever he could. His sweater pockets, his jean pockets, etc. He then shoved a few things into Izuku's hands. Here, put those somewhere, anywhere they won't be noticed too easily. So, they were stealing. Great. Izuku voiced his concerns. He wasn't sure stealing was the best idea. Hey, are you paying for these? I don't really think we should be stealing these. Izuku suddenly remembered he had some cash left over from last Monday, quick to pull it out from the front pocket of his backpack. Here, I just remembered I have some money. He hadn't even pulled out his bills before they were being shoved back into the bag. 𝗵𝗲's hand zipping it right back up. Save that for when it's more important. Izuku figured that maybe 𝗵𝗲 was right. It was probably in his best interest that he save up what he can, even if that means prioritizing himself. He still feels bad. Perhaps when he has more money he'll come back to pay. He glanced around warily, making sure nobody was looking, before shoving the gauze and alcohol pads into his pockets. When they finished walking through the aisles, 𝗵𝗲 went to the front to pay for a singular Diet Coke, both of them walking right out without anyone batting an eye. If anyone asked, Izuku would say he's rather proud of himself. Izuku will admit he had his doubts when 𝗵𝗲 started leading him down dark, narrow alleys. He was potentially signing his life away by following some almost stranger down random corners no normal person would think to turn down. But alas, he was not some normal person. He had nothing to lose, so he didn't falter when trailing 𝗵𝗲. Just as 𝗵𝗲 approached the front door to a particularly run-down building, he stopped in his tracks, forcing Izuku to stop behind him. Izuku was handed the soda without another word, while 𝗵𝗲 creeped to the entrance with experienced ease, gently twisting the handle to the door. Peeking his head through the little crack, checking all the hallways, 𝗵𝗲 waved Izuku towards him, gesturing to follow. Closing the door behind him lightly, with a soft click from the lock, Izuku was led to an apartment on the 4th floor labeled 4 degrees Celsius. Instead of 𝗵𝗲 pulling out a key to unlock the door, he just twisted it open. He just keeps his door unlocked all the time. Weird. When 𝗵𝗲 stepped aside, allowing Izuku to enter first, Izuku found exactly what he was expecting. The building itself gave it away, but damn was this place falling apart. The old paint on every wall was flaking. Old stains from God knows what on the carpeted floors, rusted windows and door frames in sight, along with a smell. Oh God, a smell. Lifting his pointer finger to cover under his nose, Izuku toed off his shoes before continuing down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He purposely passed by the kitchen. He'd be back to check it out afterwards. The apartment itself wasn't very well furnished. Only a 2-seater couch and a small table laid in the main area. Without waiting to be shown around, Izuku turned down the hallway to his right, leading to a bedroom and a bathroom. The bedroom was on the left side of the hallway, the paint on the door similarly flaking off just like everywhere else. The door was already wide open, so Izuku didn't bother waiting for permission to enter. The bedroom was a bit more lived in, from what he could tell. There was a twin-sized bed in the back corner, with a small nightstand sitting to the side. Said nightstand was overflowing with empty Diet Cokes and ashtrays. Carefully stepping over more empty bottles and strewn about clothes, Izuku did a spin in place, surveying the room around him. His eyes landed on the closet adjacent to the door, reflecting himself. Instantly stepping closer, Izuku cringed heavily at his own reflection looking back at him. Staring into his eyes was a stranger. The dried tear stains from earlier were still evident around his eyes, accompanied by the deepest eye bags Izuku's ever seen. The lack of sleep from the last few days would explain that. Shying away from the mirror, Izuku exited the room. He wasn't quite ready to really see himself just yet. walking past the frame. On Izuku's left at the end of the hall was the bathroom. Just as he was about to step past the threshold, he felt a calloused hand on his uninjured shoulder, stopping him in place. Glancing over his shoulder, Izuku came face to face with 𝗫𝗊. "Curious one, aren't you?" Dropping his hand from Izuku's shoulder, 𝗫𝗊 tilted his head in the opposite direction, urging Izuku to follow. Doing just that, Izuku was led back to the main room, where 𝗫𝗊 flopped back on the couch, sighing dramatically, getting the 𝗀 that he's supposed to sit with him. Thanks to 𝗫𝗊's incessant patting of the cushion next to him, Izuku flopped back onto the couch next, albeit gentler, not risking jostling his shoulder. 𝗫𝗊 cracked his knuckles, stretching his arms over his head. "All right, take off your shirt." Izuku straightened up suddenly. What?" His question must have shown on his face, because 𝗫𝗊 rolled his eyes dramatically before elaborating. "Your shoulder, kid. We got medical supplies for a reason, and they're sure not for me." "Oh, right." Flushing deeply, Izuku fished the gauze and alcohol pads out from his pockets and placed them on the space between him and 𝗫𝗊, hurriedly unzipping his sweater and removing it, his shirt following shortly after. 𝗫𝗊 instructed him to turn around, facing his back to him, and Izuku happily complied, already feeling more than exposed. 𝗫𝗊 was quick with his work. Doesn't mean it didn't hurt like hell though, but he was given 2 Tylenols before 𝗫𝗊 started, so he thinks that helped. As of the moment, 𝗫𝗊 worked in silence, while Izuku basked in his own thoughts. This wasn't working anymore. "So, I have a few questions. A lot of questions, actually." Izuku inhaled deeply, hoping that didn't come across too headstrong. He exhaled when 𝗫𝗊 grunted in acknowledgement. "First, what were you doing in that area? Where you found me, I mean." That was the first question he'd had when 𝗫𝗊 had first found him, and now was as good a time as ever to ask. "It was just luck that I saw you there, really. I'd just gotten done dealing with someone when I heard the fence rattling. You know what happens after that?" Izuku nodded, humming in confirmation. "Right. Next, are those staples holding your skin together?" Izuku blinked before quickly adding on, "Don't answer that if I'm overstepping." "You're not, and they are." He didn't elaborate. The rest of the conversation continued like a game, Izuku asking questions and 𝗫𝗊 answering in return. He'd asked what the owner of the diner owed him, if he'd tell anyone All Might's secret, why he helped Izuku, and lastly, why they snuck into his apartment. Izuku will admit, 𝗫𝗊 was interesting. He wasn't like anyone he'd ever met before, even after finding out Izuku was quirkless. He treated him the same as before Izuku told him. Not that the treatment was phenomenal or anything, but it still felt nice to not be a target anymore. To not have someone spit in his face about being quirkless, no, worthless. Once he'd run out of questions, he'd just started going on about his life to 𝗫𝗊, gesturing wildly with his hands. Then he felt 𝗫𝗊 stilling behind him, wondering why 𝗫𝗊 paused. Izuku looked up at him with a curious look, finding 𝗫𝗊 staring at something in front of him. No, not in front of him. He was staring at Izuku's arms, his forearms. Embarrassed, Izuku tucked in his arms at the elbows, out of view from 𝗫𝗊's eyes raking over them. "Sorry," he mumbled. 𝗫𝗊 huffed under his breath, letting out a slight chuckle. "You really think I'm one to judge?" Izuku thought about that for a moment, before understanding the joke and snorting, completely out of his control. He slapped his hand over his mouth as soon as the snort left his mouth, apologizing profusely from behind his hand. "It was meant to be a joke, lighten up," 𝗫𝗊 reassured him. It didn't make him feel much better though. Feeling 𝗫𝗊 rub antibiotic ointment on the burn, his bony fingers running across the tender skin with an unnatural care. Izuku tensed a bit, wringing his fingers together. His whole time with 𝗫𝗊 thus far has been odd. He'd been more comfortable with him than he probably should have been, but Izuku can't bring himself to distance himself. Not when he'd finally found someone who didn't judge him for something he couldn't control. While waiting for 𝗫𝗊 to finish patiently, Izuku realized he never properly thanked 𝗫𝗊. He tensed farther, hoping 𝗫𝗊 hadn't noticed. He feels bad, he needs to apologize. 𝗫𝗊 had ended up noticing. Ripping the gauze with his teeth, 𝗫𝗊 placed the roll of bandages back on the couch. "What are you thinking about? I can hear your mind racing from here." Izuku sighed, caught red-handed, lifting up his arm when instructed. Izuku spilled. I wanted to thank you." Izuku leaned his head back, already feeling the waterworks starting up. "Properly. You didn't have to help me today. No matter what you say, I would have died today if not for you." He decidedly ignored the way his voice wavered, unsure of the words spilling out of his mouth. "I didn't want to die today. You saved me, physically, and maybe even a little bit mentally. So, thank you. Thank you for climbing 10 stories for me," Izuku sniffled. "Thank you for breaking the door down. Thank you for carrying me halfway across town. Thank you for feeding me and taking care of me. Thank you for everything." Izuku wiped his tears before they could fall, trying to sit up tall before wincing. "Not sitting up, got it. I don't know who you are, frankly, but I'm glad it was you who saved me." Anyone else would have left me alone the second I uttered the word quirkless. The tears were getting harder to stop from falling, so Izuku gave up. Rubbing his eyes with the heel of his palms, Izuku continued, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. Maybe I'm trying to reassure myself that there are other people in the world out there like you, since I'm not. I don't know. I got lucky today. Izuku took a shaky breath, but before he could continue, he was cut off by a finger flicking him on the forehead. Oh, enough of that. Don't get sappy on me now. Izuku hadn't even noticed 𝗣𝗵𝗿 finishing with the gauze. When had he moved entirely from behind him on the couch to crouching in front of him? 𝗣𝗵𝗿 poked Izuku on the forehead this time, rather than flicking him. I helped you today because it was the right thing to do. Anyone who says otherwise can choke on a dick. Izuku chuckled lightheartedly at the sincerity of the insult. 𝗣𝗵𝗿 then pushed himself up from his knees with a slight groan, extending his hand for Izuku to take. He grabbed it with no hesitation, though his grip began to slip with the insecurity of the action plaguing his mind. With a firm yet comforting squeeze, 𝗣𝗵𝗿 began walking and Izuku allowed himself to be led down the hallway. Once the two were inside the bedroom, the older began to inform him on what he could and couldn't touch, pointing at them as he went. He was insisting that he sleep here for the night, while 𝗣𝗵𝗿 himself slept on the couch for the night. Apparently, it was too dangerous for a kid your age to be roaming the streets at night. But Izuku didn't want 𝗣𝗵𝗿 to leave. Was that too much to ask? It might seem a little weird to ask if 𝗣𝗵𝗿 could stay in the same room as him for the night. Would he think it's weird? Izuku doesn't think it's that weird. Panicking at the thought of being alone tonight, Izuku blurted out, Wait, can you stay here for the night? I'll sleep on the floor if you don't want to. I don't want to be alone. Great, Izuku. Didn't sound awkward in the slightest. 𝗣𝗵𝗿 sent a calculating look in Izuku's direction, as if debating it before sighing in resignation. Walking out of the room, he claimed he'd be right back. 𝗣𝗵𝗿 returned moments later in a change of clothes, tossing a pair of sweats and a tee to Izuku. Catching them with both hands, Izuku stared at 𝗣𝗵𝗿. While 𝗣𝗵𝗿 was gone, Izuku took a moment to think about the events of the past few days, when he realized that today was Monday. Yeah, he'd already known that, but he wasn't really thinking about what that meant. It was Monday, the day his mother left money on the counter. There's no way she couldn't have realized her son was missing by now. This awakened a spark of hope in Izuku. Even though he knew his mother wasn't around often, she still loved him. She has to care. It's her job as a mother. Giddy at the thought of seeing his mother again after a grueling 3 days, Izuku hurriedly threw on the clothes 𝗣𝗵𝗿 had given him. Sensing the change in mood, 𝗣𝗵𝗿 humored Izuku. All right, I give. What happened? With a smile beaming bright, Izuku explained his situation. 𝗣𝗵𝗿 nodded in understanding. Want to go back tomorrow morning? I'll walk you. God. Izuku wanted nothing more than to jump on 𝗣𝗵𝗿 and suffocate him in a giant hug. He'll respect his boundaries though. Instead, Izuku frantically nodded his head with a silly smile on his face. Having way too much energy for someone who hasn't slept in nearly 24 hours. Shutting off the lights, 𝗣𝗵𝗿 climbed into his makeshift bed made up of a pile of blankets next to the actual bed Izuku was lying on. They both wished the other good night, Izuku eagerly awaiting the next day. He'd finally be going home. Izuku awoke to the smell of coffee lingering in the air, wafting in from the crack under the door. Cringing away from the light peeking in from around the blinds, he threw out his arm blindly, patting the bed around him in search of his phone. Unsuccessful, he instead stretched his limbs out, aching from whatever he'd done yesterday. What did he do yesterday? Suddenly very aware he was not in his own bed, Izuku's eyes shot open, sitting up urgently to examine his surroundings. Oh right, 𝗣𝗵𝗿. 𝗣𝗵𝗿 had taken him to his home. Tension loosening a little, although not entirely gone, Izuku carefully crept out from under the covers, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. Man, he'd gotten lucky yesterday. Izuku doesn't think he'll ever be able to repay 𝗣𝗵𝗿. Now that Izuku was in the right state of mind, he took a moment to think of the events of the last 24 hours. Actually, scratch that, for the last 3 days. He'd already had time to dwell on All Might, but now he realizes he forgot a few things, like why he'd even tried to get off the roof in the first place. What the hell happened to Katsuki? With twitching fingers resisting the temptation to scratch at his burn, Izuku hopped off the bed. He was a man on a mission. He just hoped he wouldn't have to leave the room to complete said mission. First, Izuku gave a once-over look around him in search of his yellow bag. By the leg of the bed, he found what he was looking for. Perfect. Unzipping the main pocket, he dug his hand inside, searching between all his textbooks. Annoyingly, his phone had somehow ended up underneath all the books, so it took more effort than he'd like to get it out. Zipping the pocket back up, Izuku paused, before taking his analysis notebook out at the last second. Tossing the notebook and phone onto the sheets, Izuku searched for any phone chargers he could see. And where he couldn't see, he checked all the outlets he could find, and when he didn't find a charger in any, he continued to countertops. He checked the top of the nightstand, avoiding knocking over the mess in the progress, to no avail. Losing hope, he stalked his way over to the dressers, feeling behind the stacks of papers with his fingertips. Although he didn't find a charger back there, he definitely felt something. Taking a deep, shaky breath to avoid gagging, Izuku went back to the nightstand. This was definitely an invasion of 𝗫𝐻's privacy, but desperate times call for desperate measures. He'll just pray he doesn't find anything too weird in here. Pulling open the drawer, Izuku lit up when he found a cord attached to a portable charger in good condition lying unattended. Jackpot! He snatched it out of the drawer, not even bothering to close it before plugging the cord into his phone. While he waited for his phone to turn on, he scanned the room. He hadn't noticed it last night, but there were a lot of candles around. Like, more than the average person would have in their room. Why does he need 4 candles in one room? He thinks he might have seen a couple in the living room as well, but he's not sure how many. Very much a fire hazard with how old the apartment seemed to be. Maybe 𝗫𝐻 doesn't have electricity. It would make sense. He claimed to be living here illegally, so he obviously couldn't be paying for it. And there's no reason for the owners to have electricity in this apartment if nobody's living in it. Supposedly. Oh, maybe Izuku could help him get some electricity running up here. Yeah, that's a good idea. Step 1 to the plan of repaying for his life initiated. Izuku had taken a couple tech classes a few years ago after the power at home had gone out and he couldn't get it back on. And he figured there was no harm. Better safe than sorry, right? It helped that he never had to call an electrician to do things for him. After only a minute of debating how he'd get the electricity running, from his peripheral vision he could see the logo on his phone, signaling it was about to turn on. Giddily, Izuku brought his legs up under him in crisscross, cradling his phone in his hands impatiently. The second his home screen flashed on, he punched in his password, not waiting a second to open up the Hero News app he installed when he got the phone. It only took a few seconds of scrolling before he saw the headline he was certain he'd find. The headline read, "Promising hero student fights back against uprising villain." Could this be a future pro we're getting a sneak peek for? Speed reading the article, Izuku couldn't believe his eyes. Yeah, obviously he knew it'd be some kind of villain attack of the sort, but Katsuki was the victim. He was thinking Katsuki was trying to help someone from the villain, not the other way around, which technically still wasn't the truth. Apparently, nobody present had a quirk suitable for rescue at the scene. What a load of bullshit. Izuku could think up at least 3 plans off the top of his head reading the heroes who were present. Katsuki had reportedly lost consciousness while fighting for his life before he finally got saved by All Might. The hero's presence had sparked up a lot of questions and controversy on the internet it seems, everyone questioning why he was in Misutafu of all places. Izuku would like to know too. It wasn't a one-time thing either, it seems, because All Might has been spotted multiple times in the past couple days. Whatever, Izuku didn't care. Flicking off the article, Izuku continued scrolling through the news, looking for something in particular. His frown increasingly deepened the further he searched. He hadn't been reported. Izuku tried searching for code words such as quirkless, middle schooler, and missing, but no results. No relevant results, at least. Deep down, this is exactly what he'd been expecting, but he digresses. No news articles about him could mean a multitude of things. But he still won't get his hopes too high. Best case scenario, his mom tried reporting, but the police don't care enough to actually look into it. It's unfortunate that it's the best case scenario, but at least it'll mean that his mom noticed his absence. It'd hurt much more if she hasn't even noticed yet. Having had enough of the internet for now, Izuku shut off his phone and laid it face down on the pillow. He'd be back for it when it finished charging. With newfound purpose, Izuku tiptoed out of the room, avoiding stepping on anything. Swinging his arms by his side, Izuku eyed the blank walls of the apartment. All he noticed yesterday was that the paint was flaking, but he hadn't really noticed how empty they were. Yeah, 𝗫𝐻 doesn't technically live here, but there's not a single thing in his vision that makes this place feel like home. Well, if that's the way 𝗫𝐻 wants to live, so be it. Who's Izuku to judge? Prancing into the main room like he owned the place, Izuku surveyed the room in search of 𝗫𝐻. He wasn't in the living room, but he could hear some moving around in the kitchen. Now that he's about to turn the corner, Izuku realizes he never actually looked into the kitchen. And what a sight it was. It was painfully boring. The walls were the same beige painted tint, although it was peeling a little bit less. The fridge looked to be on its very last life, along with the small red toaster that stood out like a sore thumb in this kitchen. Well, good morning, princess. Well, looks like he can't ignore 𝗫𝐻 anymore in favor of analyzing the kitchen. When Izuku walked in, 𝗫𝐻 stood by the coffee maker, the only decent-looking thing in the kitchen. He sipped on his coffee complacently. Princess. Interesting nickname. Not to mention a weird one. Yeah, well, you sure slept like one, 𝗫𝐻 snorted, clearly amused. Now that 𝗫𝐻 mentions it, Izuku definitely does feel very well slept. Better slept than normal, at least, feeling around his face. He's also pretty sure the puffiness under his eyes went down, thankfully. How would 𝗫𝐻 know that he slept well, though? Did he sleep in? Wait, what time was it? Broaching the topic, Izuku rubbed his eyes. What time is it? 𝗵𝗿 lifted his mug to his mouth. Just hit 2 in the afternoon not too long ago. Man, 𝗵𝗿 lifted his cup into the air, as if he was cheering for him. Congrats. What'd I do to sleep like that? Izuku's jaw dropped. No fucking way did he sleep for. How long even was that? Absent-mindedly counting the hours on his fingers. He's pretty sure it was at least 18 hours. Izuku's sure they hadn't gone to sleep any later than 10 p.m. last night, so, yeah. He slept for around 17 minutes 19 hours. 𝗵𝗿 continued whether he noticed Izuku's shock or not. Izuku didn't know. Was afraid you wouldn't wake up at one point. That weekend spent on a roof sure did a number on you, huh? 𝗵𝗿 sipped loudly on his coffee. Coming back to his senses, Izuku shut his mouth, then opened it, promptly shutting it again at a loss for words. He needed to get out of here, now. His mom has to have noticed by now. And he doesn't have the heart to keep her waiting any longer. Who knows how she could be holding up right now? Izuku stormed off in the direction of the bedroom, careful not to trip over his own feet. He tended to do that when stressed. He pushed open the door with the pads of his fingers slightly too rough, but he didn't care. It wasn't aggressive enough to somehow damage the door. He takes that back. That door has seen better days. Who knows how much pressure it could take before collapsing into a pile of dust. He carefully removed the charger from his phone, checking the percentage. 34%. Good enough. He swiftly stuffed it in his back pocket. He grabbed his notebook next, frowning slightly before stuffing it in his book bag and zipping it shut. Swinging it over his shoulder, Izuku exited the room the same way he came in. He found 𝗵𝗿 much in the same spot he'd been just moments ago, instead now scrolling on his phone. Izuku cleared his throat with the intent of gaining 𝗵𝗿's attention. Instead of fully looking up to Izuku, 𝗵𝗿 instead just looked up at Izuku through his eyelashes, head still face down. This was fine. He just needed to tell 𝗵𝗿 he'd be on his way out. I'm headed out now, 𝗵𝗿. I can't leave my mom waiting any longer than I already have. I'm really sorry for taking up so much of your time. And thank you so much for everything you've done. If you want, I can't come back another time to help you with something. I noticed your electricity doesn't work, and I kinda have a knack for that kind of thing. Izuku was about to reach for the door handle out, when 𝗵𝗿 jumped up from his position leaning against the counter, abruptly wrapping his hand around Izuku's wrist, stopping him. Careful, did you forget I'm not supposed to be here? Jesus, you're gonna give me a heart attack. Letting go of Izuku's wrist, he backed away, picking back up his coffee he'd placed down in his hurry to stop Izuku. I would have actually burned you alive if I lost this place because of you. It was an obviously sarcastic bite. Hopefully. And I said I'd walk you, right? Let's go. 𝗵𝗿 then threw back the rest of his coffee, dropping the mug in the sink. We're taking the fire escape. Going down the fire escape had definitely been the right move. After putting themselves together and walking past the front entrance of the building in the direction of the train station, a very important-looking man walked out the front door. It didn't take a genius to put together that he owned the place. They just avoided a very awkward situation. The walk to the train station was a bit of a long one, and Izuku was never the type to be silent while in the presence of another, so this was inevitable. What's your quirk? Honestly, Izuku's surprised he hadn't thought to ask earlier. In his defense, he had more important things on his mind. 𝗵𝗿 dug his hands deeper into his pockets. Why? Izuku just shrugged, like it was the most obvious answer in the world. It was not. It's not that exciting, honestly. I can emit flames from my body. 𝗵𝗿 tilted his head in thought, then smirked. Oh, and they're blue, if that gives me any extra points. He made a show of proving himself, holding his hand mere inches away from Izuku's face. Blue flames erupted, dancing across his palms, before snuffing out just as quick as they appeared. Don't want to get arrested for illegal quirk use in circumstances as silly as this, after all. He didn't jump back, but rather leaned in closer, staring at his hands as if his gaze alone would bring back the flames that licked at his palms. Nonetheless, Izuku was vibrating. Flames? 𝗵𝗿 hadn't mentioned how strong the flames were, but they were flames nonetheless. It's not every day you find someone with a fire quirk, and Izuku's just maybe befriended one. What are the chances? Oh my god, that is exhilarating. I have so many questions, please let me ask them. Please, oh please do me the favor of answering all my questions. I have a lot. Can you control the temperature? I'm hoping you can, as that little bit you just showed me didn't seem especially hot. If you can get your flames hotter than that, they can do some serious damage. Izuku began gesturing wildly with his hands at this point, absent-mindedly following 𝗵𝗿. Also, can you control the firepower? The destruction you can cause would only increase if you could. Like a human flamethrower, you know. And the fact that they're blue definitely gives you some extra points. Izuku panted, out of breath. 𝗵𝗿 just stared at Izuku, bewildered. Unfaltering in his steps, he confirmed and debunked each question of the kids. Yeah. to all of those. I don't know the limits of the temperature, but the flames can get pretty hot when I want them to. Same for the firepower. I don't know the limits, but they can get pretty strong. You like quirks or something? That's pretty ironic. Liking quirks was an understatement. Quirks had fascinated Izuku since before he could read. The day Katsuki had gotten his quirk, Izuku couldn't leave his side. It was just so cool. When Izuku found out he wouldn't be getting a quirk, his interest in quirks only increased. If he won't get his own, might as well analyze others, right? Can we please test your quirk limits together one day? I'll have to see you again to fix your electricity anyways, so might as well. I'm not sure where we'd go to test the firepower, but we can figure it out. An open area would work, like a field, or maybe not. The grass would definitely burn. A court of some kind. Those are usually closed in though, and the distance you fire can go might exceed that. Whatever, the temperature we'd need to test too. That's fairly easy though, you just need to wait. Izuku dropped his hands from whatever he was gesturing. Oh my god, that's probably how you got those burns. God, I hadn't even stopped to think that maybe your quirk does damage to your body. I'm so sorry, he floundered. He hadn't even thought of the possibility that his quirk hurt him. We don't need to test anything. Izuku cut himself off, stunned by the chuckling coming from the man next to him. Kid, you sure talk a lot. These burns are old. We can still test whatever you want, so long as my body can actually handle it. He paused, before remembering what he was going to say. And you don't have to fix my electricity. You don't need to repay me. He removed his hand from his pocket, ruffling Izuku's hair gently, even though it was still covered in grime and grease. Izuku flushed, ducking his head down. He couldn't recount the last time he'd had his hair ruffled. It was sweet. He stood quiet for the rest of the walk to the train, mumbling under his breath about 𝗬𝗲𝐼's quirk and its possibilities the entire time. The train ride had been rather anticlimactic, a short one as well. Exiting the station, Izuku led the way, as he was the only one who knew where to go. The closer they got, the more Izuku sped up. It was to be expected. He wanted to see his mama ASAP. Izuku's thinking that, maybe once he comes back, things will be different. You'd think something would change after being missing for however long his mom thinks he's been missing for. She could think he's been missing since last Monday. For all he knows, he hasn't seen her since then. Aside from that, it's only logical that things will change. There's that one saying, what is it again? You don't know what you have till you lose it. Something like that. Izuku is hoping that saying still counts in this situation. He surely feels it. Or felt it. That weekend spent up on that roof changed his entire worldview. He doesn't even want to think about it. As a matter of fact, just thinking about it made him hungry. Point is, maybe once he's back, his mom will start staying home more often. He can only hope the best. He stopped in his tracks when the building came into view. Home. He's finally home. 𝗬𝗲𝐼 turned to him then, gesturing towards the homely-looking building. This it? Izuku nodded faintly, nervousness taking over. Why was he nervous? He should be excited. He's finally home. Pushing the butterflies in his stomach aside, Izuku walked closer to the entrance, reaching for the keys in his pants pocket. Except they weren't there, because these weren't his pants. Shit, these are 𝗬𝗲𝐼's. He left his own on the floor of 𝗬𝗲𝐼's apartment. Fuck, could he get any unluckier? But, now that he thinks about it, he doesn't remember feeling the keys in his own pants either. What the hell? When did he last have them? He definitely left the house with them, seeing as he locked the door behind him. And he felt them in his pocket after getting pan. He had them in school. After school maybe. Well, he remembers feeling them when pulling out his earbuds on the way home. And after the whole thing with All Might, he remembers, wait, no, he doesn't remember feeling them after All Might. So that's when it was, sometime between the sludge villain and landing on that godforsaken roof. He'll choose to blame this certain predicament on All Might, resisting the urge to face palm. Izuku sighed with defeat. Sensing the impending doom, 𝗬𝗲𝐼 crossed his arms. What now? Damn, what now? Have some faith. Maybe not at this moment, but next time. I lost the keys. 𝗬𝗲𝐼 was obviously not impressed. Izuku cringed at the perplexed expression on 𝗬𝗲𝐼's face, scratching behind his ear awkwardly. What now? He can't just break into his own building. He could probably wait it out. Eventually a resident would walk through the front door to the building, and then he could just knock on his apartment door, assuming his mother was there. Wait, she might not even be there. Who's to say she's not at the police station right now? What floor do you live on? Maybe we can get in through a window. Izuku spun to 𝗬𝗲𝐼, grinning widely. That's a perfect idea. Convenient too, considering what floor he lives on. I live on the first. Come. Jumping down the steps they walked up when they got here, Izuku skipped his way on over to the side of the building, where he remembers the window to their living room being. Fortunately, if his mother's home, the living room is the room she'll be in. She's especially fond of the couch. 𝗬𝗲𝐼 followed close behind, probably not wanting to seem like some stalker looking through people's windows. Izuku could understand, but that's a story for another day. Finally reaching the window he sure is his own, he ducked underneath, not wanting to be caught. 𝗫𝗊 followed, his knees crushing the nicely planted flowers. Izuku apologized in his head to the random woman who gardens out here. Checking his surroundings, Izuku found that he was in the clear to check inside. Hopefully the window is unlocked if his mother isn't home. Shaking his hair out of his eyes, Izuku slowly but surely raised his head to peek over the ledge into the room. He froze suddenly, astounded by what he was seeing. Izuku wasn't even sure of what he was seeing right now. He would have convinced himself he was at the wrong window, if not for his mother sitting right there. She wasn't alone. Sitting next to his mother was a man laughing at something his mother had said, holding a cup of red wine, his other hand circling 𝐀𝐦 knee. But this wasn't just any man, no, this was 𝐻𝐻𝐸. He's sure of it, how could it not be? He matches every photo he's ever seen of the man, not to mention the resemblance to himself. From the curls in his black hair to freckles splayed across his face, this was his father, without a doubt. Thoroughly shocked, Izuku turned his focus to his mother. His mother, looking the most carefree he's ever seen in his life. His mother, laughing with his father, who'd abandoned them 10 years ago. What was he even doing here? He was supposed to be in America, far, far away from here. Did she ... No. No, she wouldn't have. She couldn't have. She probably just hadn't realized Izuku was gone yet. It makes perfect sense. Teenagers are usually out with friends. That's probably what she thinks happened. Quickly wiping the tears he wouldn't let fall away, Izuku kept staring. He knows what's really going on here. He's not stupid. As much as he hates it, she just simply doesn't care. He doesn't have friends. He never has. He's always home, straight after school. That's where he's at. After all, where else would he be? He's betting that the second she realized Izuku was gone, she called 𝐻𝐻𝐸 informing him of the good news. It probably went something like, 𝐻𝐻𝐸, he's finally gone. Come home, let's celebrate. To freedom at last. Or something like that. What an eye-opener this was, to find out that nobody cared. People were celebrating his disappearance, for God's sake, wiping away another stray tear. Izuku stood up, unsure yet uncaring of whether 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐻𝐻𝐸 would see him through the window, and walked away. To where, he wasn't sure, but he'd figure it out. He could hear 𝗫𝗊 fumbling to catch up behind him, but he didn't care. He just needed to get out of here. A rough hand on his wrist stopped him, pulling him out of his stupor. Hey, what happened? What you see? Izuku's sure his emotions are showing on his face, because 𝗫𝗊 shut up quickly. Without further explanation, he led Izuku in the opposite direction, still gripping onto Izuku's wrist, but not with malice. Izuku pushed aside his emotions for the moment, waiting for when he was alone to cry. He was an emotional person, and he knew it, but that didn't mean he liked it. He hated being vulnerable in front of others, thus shutting them away. It seemed that every time he blinked, he was on another street, taking another turn and ducking through another alleyway. It was confusing. He had no idea where he was going, or how he was getting there. He's stuck in the present, unable to remember anything that's happened after leaving his building. Distantly, he knows 𝗫𝗊 is still holding his wrist, but he can't even feel it. He's numb all over, only able to blink every few minutes. He wishes he could stop himself from blinking at all. Honestly, being in a new place every time he opened his eyes was starting to get disorienting. His thoughts were floating around in his head, but they were slippery, and Izuku couldn't grab hold of them before they were gone. They fell through his fingers like sand. Oh, he's at a beach now. He's aware that he's stepping over things. Junk, loose car parts, things washed up from the sea, but he's not that one doing it. His brain isn't signaling him to step over these things. He's just going through the motions. Next thing he knows, he's sitting on a fridge laying on its side with 𝗫𝗊. He stares blankly at the view in front of him, but he's not really sure what that view is. He's just looking, not seeing. He's not seeing anything. He can feel his emotions bubbling up in him, and quickly shoves them away once again. He's half aware of the hushed whirring of 𝗫𝗊's deep voice, but he can't really. He can't process what's being said to him. Izuku's not sure how much time passes when he comes to, but it's when he finally starts to process 𝗫𝗊's words. He complained about something, a former job. Whatever it is, he's not happy about it. He let out a small sigh as if he was exhaling a breath he never knew he was holding, choking on. He tilted his head toward 𝗫𝗊, wondering what happened next. Unfortunately, he never finds out. 𝗫𝗊 pauses his story, sensing Izuku's gaze on him. Something akin to relief flashes across his face, before it's gone, arriving and departing like the waves. You back. I was starting to think my stories might bore you. Back. He definitely felt more. Here. The crash of the waves were louder now, way louder than before. He couldn't even hear them before, which seems impossible now that he thinks about it. The waves are so deafening, they almost sound like thunder, rumbling his entire body and leaving his flesh heavy in his skin, like it was actually there in the first place. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but that's not the point. He blinked again when a hand waved in front of his face. Oh, right. Sorry. Yeah, I'm back. Sorry again. That was probably so rude. 𝗫𝗏's been practically talking to himself this entire time, while Izuku's just been staring into space. He's tempted to apologize again, just for good measure. He can still feel his heart beating in his ears, much louder than it should be, and it's starting to hurt. Clenching his hand, he closes one of his hands into a fist, digging his nails into his palm in an attempt to ground him. Blood rushed into his fingers, an unnatural warmth pulsating through them. 𝗫𝗏 shifted then, stretching his back, before standing. Turning to face Izuku, he placed his hands on his hips. "You know, I never got your name." What? Had he really never told 𝗫𝗏 his name? He must think Izuku is so impolite. He didn't mean to. It's just never been the right moment. Sorry, again. It's Izuku. 𝐬𝐿 cut himself off, wringing his fingers together, unclenching his fist. He won't bother giving his family name, it's not important. Lifting his head, Izuku took in his surroundings. It wasn't hard to understand that they were on a beach, as he'd realized before, but now he knew exactly which one they were on. Dagaba Beach. He used to come here often when he was just a kid, but had stopped coming when the beach accumulated so much trash that the sand was barely visible anymore. The beach looks identical to how it did all those years ago, in that sense. He's a little confused as to why they're here though. Nobody comes here anymore, not even garbage collectors. They'd given up years ago. When 𝗫𝗏 extended his arm for Izuku to take, he didn't hesitate to pull himself up. Letting go, Izuku watched as 𝗫𝗏 walked up to an old car door and picked it up. What was he doing? Somehow understanding Izuku's thoughts, 𝗫𝗏 explained himself. "I come here when I have nothing better to do. I don't know if you've seen it, but this beach was beautiful before all this happened. A bit of good charity, I guess, helps take my mind off everything." He then picked up a chair cushion, holding it out for Izuku to take. "You gonna help?" 𝗫𝗏 encouraged him to take it by shaking it in his direction. Reluctantly, Izuku took it, examining it in his hands. It was old, definitely having seen better days. There were a handful of mystery stains. Izuku would have to make sure he sanitized his hands thoroughly after this. Instead of standing there like an idiot with a cushion in his hands, he followed alongside 𝗫𝗏, where they found somewhere to put the trash. The next few hours passed like that, save for the few breaks they took to eat. Izuku found that, yes, cleaning did help clear his mind. He was in a much better mood after some cleaning, and bickered a lot with 𝗫𝗏. It was all friendly bickering, and Izuku didn't mind. In fact, he appreciated it. Growing up, he didn't have anyone to talk to like this aside from Katsuki, but that had ended before it even started. At that moment, Izuku was lying on a bench half asleep. He'd mentioned going back to 𝗫𝗏's apartment some time ago, but 𝗫𝗏 unfortunately shook his head, stating that when he leaves the apartment, he can't go back until late at night. It's difficult to get up the fire escape, as it's pretty high up, so he'd definitely get spotted, seeing as it's bright outside. He didn't need to explain why he couldn't use the front door, and so, they'd been stuck at the beach for much too many hours, cleaning portions of the beach little by little. By the time the sun had set, Izuku had forgotten all about his mother. In the days it's been since 𝗫𝗏 took Izuku to the beach, he's learned a few things. First, 𝗫𝗏 has no sense of security. He can't even count how many times he's had to blow out a candle after 𝗫𝗏 forgot it was on. And like he said, it's only been a few days. Just the day they came back from the beach, Izuku found a candle still on in front of a curtain. How has 𝗫𝗏 survived this long? He also learned that even though 𝗫𝗏 wasn't technically homeless, he sure lived like he was. No electricity also means, as Izuku has come to realize, no anything. No lights, no water, no TV, no AC, and it's hell. 𝗫𝗏 has to use water bottles to clean himself, and if that isn't just plain old sad, Izuku doesn't know what is. Izuku makes good on his promises though, even though he didn't exactly promise anything, so he's set out to fix the electricity even if it kills him. He's mainly doing this for 𝗫𝗏, but he's pretty sure he's starting to lose it after not feeling properly clean in over a week. The last thing he learned, which also just happens to be the most intriguing, is that 𝗫𝗏 has a secret dangerous job that he doesn't want to let Izuku in on. Well, he never actually told Izuku that, but it's implied. Sort of. He noticed it first the night that they returned to 𝗫𝗏's apartment from the beach. Only about an hour after Izuku fell asleep, 𝗫𝗏 walked past him on the couch, tiptoeing so as to not wake him up, and slipped right out the window. Curious, Izuku didn't go back to sleep, and instead waited for 𝗫𝗏 to come back, which he did, at 4 in the morning, which is suspicious in itself. Feigning sleep, Izuku couldn't see 𝗫𝗏 well while also half covering his eyes. But it didn't take a genius to notice the fresh blood coating him, or the unnecessarily clean spots on the floor where he'd come in the morning after. It was obvious, but also not. Maybe if you weren't looking for it, you might not have noticed, but Izuku noticed. Not that he was looking for it. There were faded crimson streaks covering the length of 𝗫𝗏's arms, white marks evident. The glare from the moon shone through the window, illuminating 𝗫𝗏, and Izuku didn't miss the blood stuck underneath the staples around his arms, dried over into a muddy brown. Wherever he had been, he was trying to hide it. Not very well, unfortunately. That wasn't the last time something weird like that happened, no. It happened again just the next day. Instead of sneaking out unannounced though, 𝗫𝐻 just climbed out the window, announcing that he'd be back with snacks. Izuku didn't question it until the 1 hour mark had passed. Did it really take that long to get snacks? No, it didn't. Obviously 𝗫𝐻 had gone elsewhere. Wherever he'd gone took up 5 hours of his time. 5 hours. Luckily, he did in fact return with snacks. Izuku dashed to the front door the second he heard the crinkling of the plastic bag, ravenously snatching it from 𝗫𝐻's grime-covered hands. Izuku couldn't even bring himself to care at the moment. After searching through the bag, Izuku found what he was looking for, and hurriedly peeled open the plastic packaging of his snack with eager eyes. Already tearing into it, Izuku intensely scanned 𝗫𝐻. His shirt had a tear that was definitely not there 5 hours ago. Izuku asked him about it, but the question was deflected by 𝗫𝐻 complaining about how they're running out of water bottles. When you use them to wash and drink, that sort of thing happens. Then, the most recent time, it happened again yesterday. Izuku awoke alone and wasn't greeted by 𝗫𝐻 until 12 p.m. This time, Izuku let his curiosity get the best of him and just straight up asked him if he was some secret spy of the sort. 𝗫𝐻 laughed in his face, patting his head before grabbing a soda out of the fridge that didn't work. Izuku was being serious, but whatever. He'd figure it out eventually. Izuku is never asking 𝗫𝐻 for help ever again. Oh fuck. You have the unsteadiest hands ever. Izuku blinked away the tears forming from the tickling feeling in his nose. Hey, you asked me to do this. You could have done it yourself. By doing this, he means piercing Izuku's nose. Earlier in the day, 𝗫𝐻 had left to get some more water bottles, so Izuku asked him to get a piercing kit as well. He wholeheartedly expected 𝗫𝐻 to say no, that he didn't have the money to spend on futile things like a piercing kit, but instead, he seemed amused. He shot Izuku a thumbs up, and came back less than an hour later with a case of water, a chocolate croissant, and a piercing kit. Afraid Izuku would mess it up if he did it himself, he mistakenly asked 𝗫𝐻 to do it for him. Never again. Okay, I'm gonna put it through now, for real this time. No holding back. 𝗫𝐻 waved the needle in front of Izuku's face. You ready? Ready as I'll ever be. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut. He'd rather not watch the needle go through his nose. Okay, 3, 2. 𝗫𝐻 lined up the needle to the spot on the side of Izuku's nose he'd marked with a Sharpie. 1. Izuku's eyes shot open when the sensation of cold metal pierced his skin, jumping out of his skin at the odd feeling. He was kept in place by 𝗫𝐻's hand clamping down on his shoulder. Fuck, sit still. 𝗫𝐻 hissed. Izuku shuddered, struggling to contain the myriad of profanities slipping from his mouth unwarranted. He let more out when he felt the telltale thickness of blood flowing from the piercing. Geez, do you speak to your mother with that mouth? 𝗫𝐻 chuckled, fumbling to find a napkin, something to wipe the blood before it leaked onto the couch. The ratty old thing was dirty enough without his blood on it. Izuku deadpanned at him, hardly keeping his jaw in place. Was that joke intentional? 𝗫𝐻 spared a glance behind him to see if the bleeding had gotten any worse while in search of a napkin, instead finding Izuku staring at him like he'd grown too soon. 𝗫𝐻 blinked awkwardly. Izuku blinked back. Too soon, trying not to sneeze at the same time. Izuku held his hand under his chin to catch the warm, wet blood dripping. He grabbed the napkin offered to him, pinched between 𝗫𝐻's index and middle finger, and started to ferociously dab at his chin and nose. How did this even happen? He's like 70% sure nose piercings aren't supposed to bleed this much. He eyed 𝗫𝐻 suspiciously as he stood up, dusting off his knees. Instead of tending to Izuku's wounds, he just swung open the fridge and pulled out a lukewarm glass bottle, Diet Coke. Seriously, I'm bleeding out on your couch, and you think it's a great time to get a Coke? Izuku rolled his eyes playfully. 𝗫𝐻 pulled a lighter out of his pocket, using the bottom to pop open the cap. Oh please, that's dramatic. You'll be fine. Hey, didn't you say you'd fix my electricity? He pointed his bottle. Izuku groaned, picking himself up off the couch. He did say he would, didn't he? Now is no time to complain, he figured. But first, he needed to get some alcohol pads. Hey, pass me that. Izuku pointed to the pliers. He'd been standing on the couch cushion for a solid 10 minutes now, attempting to get the electricity working. It's taking a little longer than he'd like to, but alas, he's honestly surprised 𝗫𝐻 even had electrical gloves lying around. But he won't look a gift horse in the mouth. He could do without being electrocuted. Taking the pliers from 𝗫𝐻's hand, he continued with his work. What a weird thing this is. Just a week ago, he'd be in one of his last classes of the day right now, writing down notes. Now, he was fixing a possibly secret spy's electricity. It took only a mere 5 more minutes for Izuku to get the electricity up and running, and he couldn't be any more grateful. Once Izuku was sure he'd finally fixed it, he signaled for 𝗫𝐻 to flick the light switch. Lazily, 𝗫𝐻 complied, likely not believing it would work, as it hadn't the last 4 times. Instead, the light slowly flickered to life, like it was nervous to be turned on after who knows how long. Immediately, 𝐬𝐸 jumped off the couch and sprinted in the direction of the bathroom to take the longest, steamiest shower of his life. Unluckily, 𝗵𝐴 beat him to it, harshly slamming the door in 𝐬𝐸's face. "Fuck you, let me in." 𝐬𝐸 banged on the door with both fists. "I got it working. I deserve the first shower." "He can't believe this." Shuffling came from the other side of the door. "You snooze, you lose. You're only here because of me. Therefore, I get first shower." The shower turned on then, the sweet sound of water pressure hitting the unused shower floor. Admitting his defeat, 𝐬𝐸 dragged his feet back to the couch, slumping against the cushions. He wouldn't be getting his shower for a while. 𝐬𝐸 stepped out of the bedroom, clad in fresh clothes and clean hair, and moseyed his way into the kitchen. This was great. Not only did they have electricity now, but it was completely unpaid. 𝐬𝐸 pities the person who will eventually find their bill to be double the price. Cracking open the fridge door, 𝐬𝐸 smiled cheekily at the cold air that hit his face. He never thought he'd be so grateful for a cold drink. Unfortunately, the fridge was filled with nothing but Diet Coke and water. They couldn't even drink milk because it'd spoil before the first use. Well, that's all about to change. Not that he missed milk much, he could definitely live without it. Swiping one of 𝗵𝐴's blissfully chilled Diet Cokes, 𝐬𝐸 cracked it open, leaning against the countertop chugging his drink. He looked over to where 𝗵𝐴 was seated on the couch when his name was called. "Princess, I have an idea." 𝗵𝐴's voice rang out from the living room. "An idea? That sounds ominous. This could go one of many ways, and he isn't sure if any of them are good." He hummed around the soda and continued to down his drink, acknowledging 𝗵𝐴's statement. If he choked on it, that was no one else's business but his own. Strolling up to the other side of the counter, 𝗵𝐴 continued, "Well, I'm not gonna tell you. Where's the fun in that?" 𝐬𝐸 rolled his eyes, then whined at the loss of his drink when it was snatched out of his hand. "Put your shoes on, we're going out." "Going out? Going out where?" Shrugging to himself, 𝐬𝐸 headed to the front door where his shoes stayed anyway. It's been days since 𝐬𝐸's seen the light of day, so he's not complaining for some odd reason. Before they left, 𝗵𝐴 handed him a black tote bag, instructing him to put it around his shoulder. It's completely empty, and he doesn't have anything to put in it, but whatever. 𝗵𝐴 does whatever 𝗵𝐴 wants. Climbing out the window behind 𝗵𝐴, 𝐬𝐸 jumped down the rest of the way, landing on the ball of his feet. He's gotten quite good at that now, he likes to think. The fall truthfully isn't very high, no higher than roughly 9 feet, but the first time he jumped down, he landed a bit weird. Now he does it without a second thought, keeping pace with the man next to him. 𝐬𝐸 took in his surroundings. It wasn't dark just yet, but gathered from looking down at the time on his phone, the sun is bound to set in less than an hour. What could 𝗵𝐴 possibly want to do at this time of day? After about 10 minutes of walking, 𝐬𝐸 promptly finds out. The shopping district. They were in the shopping district. Why the hell would 𝗵𝐴 be here? "We're going shopping. You can't keep using my clothes, so you're getting your own," 𝗵𝐴 informed him. "Do you even have the money for that?" "Likely not, considering he couldn't even buy some first aid." "Because I sure don't." 𝗵𝐴 huffed. "Of course I don't. 5-finger discount." "5-finger discount? What's that? Is it a literal discount?" "The 5-finger discount is the reason we brought that." He interrupted himself to point at the bag hanging off of 𝐬𝐸's shoulder. "Bag. You're sneaky, right? Just look depressed enough that the workers will eye you with pity and not suspicion." So that's what the bag was for. They were stealing again. Or, as 𝗵𝐴 had just put it, using a 5-finger discount. Not that 𝐬𝐸 really minds. He has 𝗵𝐴 to back him up if he gets caught. And who is he to refuse free things? It'd be different if they were stealing from a small business, like that corner store from before. But this is a huge mall full of corrupt companies that don't pay their workers nearly enough. There's a difference, and 𝐬𝐸 will take advantage of that. Adjusting the bag on his shoulder, 𝐬𝐸 confidently led 𝗵𝐴 to the store he'd been eyeing. "These are so chic." 𝐬𝐸 examined the sunglasses in his hands. They were all black with no frame, and thankfully not rounded. Rounded glasses kind of make you look like a nerd. He turned the glasses around, searching for the price. He cringed when he found it, decidedly ignoring it, and putting them on. "Chic? Who the hell says chic?" 𝗵𝐴 tapped his foot against the floor impatiently. They were only really here for 𝐬𝐸. 𝗵𝐴 only grabbing a few things he liked, so 𝐬𝐸 was the leader for the night. He likes taking his time. "I say chic. Say, how do these look on me?" He posed for 𝗵𝐴, replicating the models in magazines he's seen. "Fine. Are we done yet?" Rolling his eyes, 𝐬𝐸 shoved the glasses to the bottom of his bag, under the stacks of clothes and such. They just hit hour mark 4, in their 6th store of the night. 𝐬𝐸 went all out, so what? He's allowed to spoil himself once in a while. They also surprisingly hadn't been caught. They'd gotten a few stares, of course, but that's all. If 𝗵𝐴 hadn't been here though, then he'd have a problem. The only way they had to bypass the detectors at the front of every store was by melting it off, which wouldn't be possible without 𝗵𝐴. He'd individually melted each tag off of every item, dropping it inconspicuously into the nearest trash can at the time. Izuku honestly didn't even think it would work at first. But you learn something new every day, right? Yeah, we can head out now. Actually, can we make one more stop? I'm thirsty. Even though it's so late out, he can't bring himself to want to head back to the apartment just yet. Who knows how long he'll be holed up in there till the next time he goes out. May as well make use of this opportunity. Ignoring 𝗵𝗊's groan from behind him, Izuku casually strolled out the front of the store, knowing he wouldn't go off. He was proven very wrong by the blaring alarm echoing off the walls. Whipping around, Izuku locked eyes with 𝗵𝗊, who looked just as stunned as Izuku. Was that him? Maybe someone else who just happened to be stealing walked through the door at the same time as him. Eyeing his surroundings, he found nothing of the sort. He did find a worker speed walking towards him though. Fuck. Putting on his best innocent 14-year-old face, Izuku smiled down at the woman. Excuse me, do you mind if I check your bag? Just precautions, I'm sure you don't have anything. The alarms are a bit silly sometimes. Yes, he did mind, because literally everything in this bag was stolen. And she didn't fool him. He didn't miss the skepticism radiating off of her. These alarms definitely did their job right. Chuckling awkwardly, Izuku glanced behind her head to where 𝗵𝗊 stood, hoping the panic in his face was obvious. Or maybe that's not a good thing. If 𝗵𝗊 can see it, that means this woman in front of him can also see it, which just makes him all the more suspicious. Through his peripheral vision, he also found that more workers and shoppers alike were staring his way. Not getting any visible response from 𝗵𝗊 besides a shrug, Izuku turned his attention back to the worker whose impatience is clearly growing thin. God, he was so going to regret this later, but he could not go to jail for this. Or better yet, they'd somehow find out that he was a missing child and call his mom. Actually, that probably wouldn't happen. He's like 80% sure he was never actually reported. Tightening his hold on the bag, Izuku swept out the woman's legs from under her and bolted out of there. Not looking back in fear of tripping, he made his way to where he's sure the nearest exit was, which just so happened to be on the more packed side of the mall. Why were so many people at the mall anyways? Get out of here, go home. Hey, someone stop him. Shit. Glancing back, Izuku found 2 security guards on his tail. Cursing harshly under his breath, Izuku forgoes the exit, instead rushing to the escalator to his right. Mumbling apologies to every person he pushed out of the way, Izuku skipped the steps, 2 at a time, gripping onto the bag tighter with each second, knuckles white as his fingers were clenched around the strap. At this point, people were luckily starting to get the hint, clearing a path for him, unwilling to get in his way. Sidestepping an ice cream cart, Izuku sprinted to the second-floor parking lot entrance when he spotted 2 security guards standing on either side, radios up to their ears. Upon seeing Izuku, they both confirmed something with the individual on the other line and trekked their way to Izuku warily. Seriously, is stealing really such a big deal that he needs like 4 security guards on him? Groaning internally at his awful luck, Izuku spun on his heel, running back the way he came. Digging through his bag, he slipped into the hero merchandise store to his right. Fortunately, a huge sale was happening today, thus, the store was packed. Pulling the hat he got 3 stores ago out of his bag, Izuku ducked down to the height of everyone else's waists. Stuffing his obvious green curls into the hat, he hastily slipped off his sweater, wrapping it around his waist instead. Content with his spur-of-the-moment get-up, Izuku returned to the surface, putting his previously non-existent acting skills to use. At the last moment, he pulled the sunglasses out of the bag, remembering how memorable his viridian eyes are. Ignoring the beating of his heart, Izuku followed the crowd's lead as they all made room for the security guards to search for Izuku. Holding his breath, he watched as one of the guards that were standing by the parking lot walked right in front of him, complaining on his radio about how the guy vanished. Once the guard was far enough, Izuku casually strolled out of the store like this was an everyday occurrence. Adjusting the glasses on his face, Izuku walked at what he hoped was a normal pace back to the main entrance of the mall. Geez, you'd think he was a villain trying to kill someone. Since when did security guards actually take their jobs seriously? Thankful that the mall entrances didn't have their own alarms, he passed through the overlooming frame, out into the night. Waiting for him leaning against the wall was none other than 𝗵𝗊. Took you long enough. Was starting to think maybe you'd gotten caught. Izuku scoffed. Yeah, because you were helpful. And what if I just left a different way? Then you'd be standing here like an idiot waiting for no reason. And I'd be at the apartment waiting for you. 𝗵𝗊 started walking away from the mall at this point, so Izuku followed. He didn't miss the way they were headed in the opposite direction of the apartment. Lucky guess. And you didn't need my help, did you? 𝗵𝗊 cocked his head in Izuku's general direction. Okay, maybe he didn't need 𝗵𝗊's help, but it would have been appreciated. He didn't grant 𝗵𝗊 an answer. After only a minute of walking, Izuku's curiosity got the best of him. He glanced around, trying to place when he'd been here before, because he definitely has. He recognizes the area, but also doesn't. It's giving him that weird déjà vu feeling. Izuku had to do a double take when his eyes almost skipped over the very neon diner across the street. So that's why Izuku recognizes this place, because he was here only a few days ago when 𝗵𝗿 had taken him to eat at the diner. A shame they'll probably never be able to eat there again. They've almost definitely been blacklisted. But if they're not here for the diner, why else? The only other place in this general area that he can think of would be the beach. But he can't imagine why 𝗵𝗿 would need to go there again. He also can't think of why he would go when Izuku was with him. So many questions, yet no answers. Are we going to the beach? Izuku surmised. Perceptive, I see. 𝗵𝗿 hummed, that we are. Like I said, it's good to get your mind off things. I also need to do something. You're just along for the ride. Suddenly, Izuku was a lot more interested. Oh, am I finally gonna find out why you've been disappearing for hours throughout the day? Was I right? Are you a secret spy? Izuku speculated, giddy at the idea of him being correct. Looking up slightly, he didn't miss the way 𝗵𝗿 smirked, although not answering. Izuku tried guessing a few more times, but none of the guesses were met with answers but rather silence and the pattering of their feet across the sidewalk. Whatever, two could play at that game. Izuku stayed quiet the rest of the walk. He'd find out eventually anyways. Name 3 pre-Quirk writers. William Shakespeare, George Orwell, and... Izuku fumbled over his words, struggling to name another writer on the spot. Picasso. Wrong. 10 push-ups. Adjusting his position against the sand, he complied, wiping the sweat threatening to drip from his forehead. Izuku looked back up to 𝗵𝗿 expectantly. Okay, next. How many letters are in the English alphabet? Izuku smiled cheerfully, knowing he had this one in the bag. That's easy. 26. His smile fell when the most shit-eating grin took over 𝗵𝗿's features. Wrong, it's 18. 15 push-ups. Pushing himself up with his palms, Izuku sat on his knees, deliberating whether or not 𝗵𝗿 hit his head a little too hard recently. What the fuck? Are you illiterate? It's 26, not 18. Look it up. 𝗵𝗿 crossed his arms over his chest, completely sure of himself. Nope, it's 18. Come on, 15 push-ups. Groaning, Izuku threw himself forward once more, completing the push-ups. He doesn't even know why they're here, honestly. Sure, he didn't have many expectations, but he sure wasn't expecting to be doing quiz workouts. At the very least, he was expecting 𝗵𝗿 to show him some super secret spy organization putting together a meeting or something. Okay, maybe he had expectations, but that's insignificant. What was the point of this? The second they even stepped foot onto the beach, 𝗵𝗿 had begun spewing instructions for Izuku to follow, and he didn't know what else to do besides follow orders. Finishing his last push-up, Izuku flopped down onto the sand, completely worn out for the day. Maybe if he asked nicely enough, then 𝗵𝗿 would carry him back. Closing his eyes, Izuku let the sound of his heartbeat slow back down to a normal pace before sitting back up. Sitting crisscross before 𝗵𝗿, cringing, Izuku watched as 𝗵𝗿 slipped a pack of cigarettes out of his back pocket, lighting one up with the tip of his finger. Entranced, he watched as the blue flames engulfed the end of the cigarette, somehow still keeping its color. The flames soon died out just as quick as they lit up. Taking a drag from the cigarette, 𝗵𝗿 held it out for Izuku to take, offering the stick to him. Managing to keep his face neutral, Izuku shook his head no, uninteresting. He was never one to take up smoking, no matter how many of the cool kids at school did it. 𝗵𝗿 huffed, approving of Izuku's rejection. Good, I would have put it out on the backside of your hand if you tried taking it. Choosing to ignore the threat, Izuku asked for what feels like the millionth time now, can you tell me what we're doing here now? He pouted. I thought you were going to show me what you do when you disappear for hours of the day. Not whatever this is. Izuku took the hand that 𝗵𝗿 held out for him, pulling himself up. Well, nobody told you to make any assumptions about where I was taking you. He started walking deeper into the beach, Izuku on his trail, looking around at the piles of trash surrounding them. And anyways, it's not safe for me to show you where I go. Which is why we're here, so that you can actually gain some muscle to take care of yourself. Picking up trash for hours on end does wonders for your body, could you believe it? Picking up a broken car door as they walked, 𝗵𝗿 held it out behind him for Izuku to take. As soon as he had a grip on it and 𝗵𝗿 removed his, the door's weight doubled, leaving Izuku to scramble, attempting to get both hands on it. Damn, this thing weighs a ton. Izuku tuned 𝗵𝗿 out, already jaded by today's events. His curiosity is killing him. At this point, he'd do just about anything to find out where 𝗵𝗿 was sneaking off to. Blindly grabbing the next thing 𝗵𝗿 passed back to him, Izuku's hand wrapped around the base of something. Looking down at the item in his hand, Izuku examined it, turning it around. Huh, interesting. A hatchet. What's a hatchet doing in a place like this? He wondered aloud, more to himself than anything. Good condition too. It's a little beaten up, but definitely not looking too bad compared to everything else in this place. That's an axe, not a hatchet. Izuku looked back up to where 𝗵𝗿 was walking in front of him, except now he's peering over his shoulder to see what the teen is talking about. Gaze falling once again to the tool in his hand. Izuku confirmed that this is definitely not an axe. Nope, this is definitely a hatchet, he announced. What's even the difference? 𝗵𝗲 stupidly asked. They do the same thing. Has this guy been living under a rock his whole life? Yeah, they have the same purpose, but a hatchet is more handy, easier to use. The handle and head are smaller than an axe, making it more compact. It's just more convenient, especially for people who can't handle swinging around such a heavy tool like an axe. 𝗵𝗲 chuckled in front of him at the explanation. Perfect for someone like you then, huh? Izuku rolled his eyes, inspecting the tool in his hand once more. Even though it was meant as an insult, 𝗵𝗲 might just be right. It didn't hurt to keep himself protected. Right, the universe was basically begging him to take it, with it being one of the first things they were going to throw away from this dump. And the hatchet is pretty handy. It's lightweight, fairly easy to hold. The blade is obviously dull, but that can be fixed. Not giving it another thought, Izuku shoved the tool under his arm, focusing both hands back onto the car door. He had a feeling he and the fire wielder would be here for a while. They arrived back at the apartment later that night, Izuku thoroughly tired out. He didn't waste a second before hopping in the shower, rushing to get straight into bed. His bed is still the couch. He honestly didn't mind sleeping on the couch. It gave him a good view of the overall layout of the apartment if he slept facing the front door. The window was right by his head, so he wouldn't miss anyone sneaking in or out of it. Same goes for the front door, although it doesn't get used often. He also doesn't have to walk very far to get to the kitchen, which is a huge plus. The only complaints Izuku has about his current situation is how unbelievably bored he gets. He wouldn't have it any other way, don't get him wrong. 𝗵𝗲 is single-handedly the best thing that could have possibly happened to him, but he has nothing to do. There's only so much time you can spend on your phone before you get tired of that. At least before the All Might situation, he had things to do. School was honestly the only place he went, since he didn't have any friends to go out with, but it was still something, even though it sucked. It's not that 𝗵𝗲 makes him stay in the apartment, per se, more so just that Izuku doesn't even know what he'd do if he left. He still doesn't have any friends. And now he also doesn't have any money. If someone were to ask Izuku if his boredom is what led up to the following situation, he'd deny it immediately, but he knows the truth. Uncertain of what awoke him, Izuku cracked open his eyelids, finding 𝗵𝗲 tiptoeing around Izuku to reach the window. Izuku didn't make it obvious that he'd woken up, instead content to watch 𝗵𝗲 leave tonight, as he does every other night. Except, this time is different, isn't it? Izuku hadn't noticed at first, but there was something in 𝗵𝗲's hand. He'd also come out of the kitchen, which isn't necessary to pass through if he needed to get to the window. Izuku strained his eyes, keeping as still as humanly possible. Izuku's eyes widened when he registered the object in the man's hand. A kitchen knife. 𝗵𝗲 held a kitchen knife in his hand, sliding a hand from under his pillow onto his chest. Izuku felt his heart rate pick up. Is he really part of some secret spy organization? Izuku was just joking at first, but it's starting to seem more and more plausible. What is he supposed to do about this? Should he even do anything about this? 𝗵𝗲 had been very adamant about Izuku not getting involved, but what else was there to do? And he was already awake, right? Might as well. Watching as 𝗵𝗲 ducked his head out of the window before checking below him and then hopping out, Izuku slowly bundled up the blanket enveloping him, pushing it down to where his feet previously were. Checking over his shoulder to make sure 𝗵𝗲 was already down the fire escape, Izuku swung his legs over the edge of the couch, power walking over to the front door. Hopping on one foot as he tried shoving his other one in a shoe, Izuku paused. He had no idea where 𝗵𝗲 would actually lead him. Now that he thought about it, he could potentially be leading him to his death. Or worse, both of their deaths. Cursing, Izuku ran back to the front door, picking up the hatchet he'd left there a few hours ago. Couldn't hurt, right? Bounding over to the fire escape, Izuku looked over the edge, locating 𝗵𝗲's identifiable violet scars turning a corner, exiting his view. Hurrying to climb down the ladder, Izuku landed on the hard concrete alleyway, making haste. He couldn't afford to lose sight of 𝗵𝗲. He was already risking enough as it is, not daring to get too close. If 𝗵𝗲 turned too many corners just slightly too quickly, Izuku would lose him, turning into yet another unfamiliar alley. Izuku then realizes that if he loses 𝗵𝗲, he himself will also be frighteningly lost. Somehow, the area Izuku finds himself to be in is increasingly worse than the one 𝗵𝗲 resides in, which he thought to be impossible. Is he making a mistake? Should he have stood at the apartment instead? No, it's too late to regret past Izuku's decisions. What's done is done, he has to follow through now. Swapping the hatchet from his right hand to his left, Izuku wiped his hand against his sweatpants, the risk of the situation catching up to him. He should have just listened to 𝗵𝗲 and minded his own damn business, and none of this would have been happening right now. He'd be laying down peacefully sleeping if he'd ignored what he'd seen. But no, of course not. He could never make things easy for himself. Where in the world were they even going right now? 𝗫𝗊's been walking with purpose for a good 20 minutes, at the least, and yet he hasn't made a single stop. What time is it even right now? He hadn't had a moment to check the time before he left, so it could be 3 in the morning for all he knows. Patting around his hoodie pockets, Izuku searched for his phone. Then he checked his pants pockets, barely resisting the urge to face palm. Izuku squeezed the hatchet in his hand tighter. Whatever, he could go without his phone for however long this took. Too caught up in his search for his phone, Izuku almost missed as 𝗫𝗊 took a sharp turn into yet another suspicious-looking alley. Speeding up his steps, Izuku prepared himself to turn the corner just as fast as 𝗫𝗊 had in order to catch up. This was a mistake, as 𝗫𝗊 hadn't gone much farther, instead leaning against the wall. Izuku promptly reversed his steps, pushing himself up against the wall at the mouth of the alley. Why was he just standing there? Is he expecting something? A person, maybe. He could be meeting someone here. Crap. He hopes whoever he's meeting won't come from this side of the alley. Suddenly very aware of his surroundings, Izuku looked around, heart in his throat. Above him and to the side, Izuku spotted a fire escape leading to the roof of the building. Biting his bottom lip anxiously, Izuku ventured to the ladder. It wasn't the ideal hiding place, but it would have to do. If 𝗫𝗊 felt he had to bring a knife, Izuku wasn't willing to announce his presence. After shoving the handle of the hatchet into his pants waistline and angling the head away from his torso, Izuku slipped off his sneakers, calculating whether he could make the jump. It wasn't too high, honestly, and Izuku has faith in being able to reach it. Setting his sneakers down on the floor next to him, Izuku once more wiped his hands on his pants, ridding them of the sweat that accumulated. Counting down in his head, Izuku jumped up, reaching for the bottom of the ladder. Just barely missing it, he used his sock-covered feet to push himself just a little bit higher, enough for him to grasp on. Hurriedly pulling himself up with both hands, Izuku climbed up, eternally grateful for the lack of sounds the ladder made. His efforts would have been for naught if a measly ladder sold him out. Scrambling onto the roof, Izuku crawled to the edge, peeking his head over the edge to find 𝗫𝗊 in the exact same position he'd been in a minute ago. Not another person in sight. Wow, this place really is isolated. He supposes that's why it's the chosen meeting spot. If this even is a meeting he snuck his way to. Getting comfortable while still keeping an eye out for anything suspicious, Izuku rested his chin on his forearms, waiting for what was yet to come. He didn't have to wait any longer than maybe 5 minutes before something in the distance caught his attention. The man slinking through the alleys wasn't anything to bat an eye at. Honestly, it was just his body language that gave him away. He hunched over himself, repeatedly checking over his shoulder from time to time. He was rather frail as well, jumping at the slightest sounds going bump in the night. From what Izuku could see, he definitely didn't see this guy coming to meet 𝗫𝗊 for some dangerous meeting. But, as they say, never judge a book by its cover. As the man approached the alley 𝗫𝗊 stood in, he flipped his hood over his head, tucking the blonde strands behind his ears. Trying to hide his identity, maybe? Doesn't seem too far-fetched, in Izuku's humble opinion. The man was clearly anxious, hands fidgeting with something in his hoodie pockets. Izuku leaned in slightly closer. 𝗫𝗊 seems to have finally become aware of the man approaching him, because he turned in the direction the blonde was coming from. The man tensed, but didn't falter in his steps. Finally, he approached 𝗫𝗊, removing his hands from his pockets, instead crossing them over his chest in a show of intimidation. It clearly didn't work, 𝗫𝗊 kicking off the wall and correcting his posture, looming over the taller man. Izuku didn't have to hold back his eye roll at the arrogance rolling off of him in waves. The two began conversing in hushed tones, and Izuku couldn't hear shit. Creasing his eyebrows, Izuku leaned in more, careful not to lean too far off the edge. Tuning out the rest of the world, Izuku focused on the way the blonde's mouth moved, unable to see 𝗫𝗊's front from his angle. "Promise. You money, I'm short now. Help me, I'm desperate," the man cried out. Izuku may not be the best lip reader, but he gets a vague idea of what's going on here. Whatever this man needs, 𝗫𝗊 has, and he doesn't seem willing to give it up. What could 𝗫𝗊 possibly have that this guy needed though, anyways? Izuku recalled the knife he'd seen 𝗫𝗊 walk out with, but that couldn't be right. A kitchen knife. What would this guy need a cheap kitchen knife for? This didn't make sense to Izuku, and it's bothering him. Maybe drugs. 𝗫𝗊 seems like the type of guy to sell drugs, and this other guy definitely seems like the type of person to be begging for drugs. It's not that improbable, and yet, Izuku's not sure that's what's happening here. Izuku blinks, and next thing he knows, there's a gun pointed dead center at 𝗫𝗊's face, and then quirks were being used. Flames engulfed the alleyway below him, the temperature surrounding them tripling itself. What the fuck? Izuku slapped his hand over the lower half of his face, unconcerned of giving away his cover. What the hell just happened? He barely looked away for a moment, and suddenly guns are being pulled out and 𝗫𝗊's using his quirk. And holy hell if those flames are hot. Izuku would have to gush about that to 𝗫𝗊 later. Hey, Izuku whipped his head around to the newcomer, shocked that the two below him didn't hear his neck snap with how sharp the turn was. A hero has arrived. If he weren't in this current situation, Izuku would have been jumping for joy being so close to watching a villain fight if one of the people involved weren't his friend. Izuku recognized the hero too, a fairly new underground hero who goes by the name of Prize. His quirk wasn't anything to gawk at, just a simple telekinesis quirk allowing him to take an object from someone's hands, but he got the job done. Just last month, Izuku read an article about how quickly he was rising the ranks, considering his obscurity. This just makes everything that much more unfortunate for 𝗵𝗿. Alerted to the hero's presence, 𝗵𝗿 bolted to the other end of the alley, leaving the likely dead man's body where he lay. Izuku averted his eyes, already holding back a gag. Those burns were nasty. The smell of burning flesh already started wafting through the air, fanning itself out. Izuku couldn't hold back the gag threatening to tear itself from his throat. Racing after the fire wielder, Prize pursued him, although unable to use any quirk due to nothing being in 𝗵𝗿's hand at the moment. Izuku should do something, right? His literal only friend is being chased down by a hero, and all he can do is watch from a rooftop. Clenching his fists, Izuku shakily stood up, only to get a better view of the chase. It'd be stupid of him to interfere. It'd only be an inconvenience. 𝗵𝗿 has gotten this far without any assistance, so he should be fine this time as well. Walking unsteadily to the other side of the roof, Izuku watched as the hero caught up to 𝗵𝗿, wrestling him against a brick wall, the back of his head thumping against it with a sharp crack, loud enough to echo. Unable to stand any longer, Izuku slunk down onto his knees. As a last-ditch effort, Izuku watched on as 𝗵𝗿 pulled the knife out of his pocket, angling the tip at Prize before his wrist was caught by the hero's, twisting 𝗵𝗿's wrist in an inhumane way. The knife was plunged into 𝗵𝗿's side. The blade was so far deep that only the handle remained visible. Keeping the weapon in 𝗵𝗿's side, the hero proceeded to spin 𝗵𝗿 around by his shoulders, one hand holding 𝗵𝗿's face against the rough bricks, the other snapping cuffs around 𝗵𝗿's wrists. Squinting, Izuku cursed when he read the letters QS carved into the side of the cuffs. 𝗫𝗟. Would now. Izuku definitely couldn't just leave him there now. His hopes of 𝗵𝗿 getting out of here have dwindled down to nearly nothing. Without his quirk, and likely honing a nasty concussion along with a stab wound, there's no way 𝗵𝗿 is getting out of this. Fuck. On one hand, if Izuku were to involve himself now, he might just be able to save 𝗵𝗿 from his inevitable fate. On the other hand, the more probable side, Izuku jumps in like an idiot trying to defend his maybe friend, ending up with his face in a wall alongside 𝗵𝗿, only managing to embarrass himself. Was it really worth it? Was risking his life to save another's really worth it? Was attempting to save the life of the person who saved him worth it? Was risking going to jail for sabotage worth it? His questions seemed to answer themselves. Lifting up the hem of his t-shirt, Izuku slipped the hatchet out of his waistband and adjusted his grip on it, facing the head away from him. He was really doing this, wasn't he? He hadn't had the time to stop and think about it with everything happening below him so quickly. But he's never felt so genuinely terrified in his life. A lot was on the line right now, and it wasn't just himself at risk. If he fucked up, he'd also be responsible for whatever happened to 𝗵𝗿. His blood would be on Izuku's hands. And Izuku isn't sure he could handle being the cause of his death or arrest. As it is, not fucking up is the only option. Climbing down as quickly as possible, Izuku skipped the last handle in favor of jumping off, ignoring the way his ankle twisted just slightly off. Time wasn't on his side right now, so he couldn't waste it. Izuku fought to control his breathing as he turned the corner he previously looked over. Neither of the men seemed to have noticed Izuku's presence yet, and he was going to take full advantage of the fact. Although 𝗵𝗿 doesn't seem capable of noticing anything at the moment. This wasn't a good thing. He didn't even have a plan. What is he supposed to do? He can't go up against a licensed hero. Well, Izuku may not have a license, but he does have a hatchet. Throwing all regards for his safety out the window, Izuku held his hatchet above his head and ran, squeezing his eyes shut as he charged forward. Izuku swung down blindly, praying he hit something that would actually injure the hero. You know, now that he thinks about it, aiming a strike with his eyes shut probably wasn't the best idea. Feeling the blade cut deep into flesh, Izuku hesitantly cracked open his eyes, both hands still gripping the wooden handle like his life depended on it. He took a deep, stuttering breath when he realized just how vital his strike was. The blade sunk into the hero's neck diagonally. Not completely cut through, the blade too dull to do such a thing. Thick blood gushed from the wound, pooling around the blade and running down the hero's arm and back. Izuku kept his grip on the handle as Prize removed his hands from 𝗵𝗿's wrists, hovering around the weapon protruding from his neck. Oh god, what has Izuku done? Finally, Izuku released his grip, taking as many steps backward as possible before tripping over himself, falling onto the concrete floor. He couldn't even register the pain shooting up his tailbone, too focused on the way the hero before him lowered to his knees, finding his own grip on the handle. He didn't try pulling it out, just barely conscious enough to know that would only make matters worse. It didn't help him much in the end, with him ultimately losing balance and falling on his side, hands still hovering around the weapon, no longer a tool, a weapon. Izuku gagged once more when he landed on the side the weapon jutted out from, effectively jamming it deeper into the hero's neck, severing the thin metaphorical string holding together the hero. Pryze's head hit the concrete hard, the sound ingraining itself into Izuku's memories. The head rolled against the blood-stained concrete for only a moment. When at last it stopped moving, lifeless eyes staring into Izuku's petrified ones. Averting his eyes from the gore presenting itself to Izuku, the teen crawled over to a dark corner, emptying his stomach loudly. Fuck, that wasn't meant to happen. Coughing out the last remnants of sick, Izuku wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his hoodie, reminding himself to throw it out ASAP. He ran his hands through his curls, unsure of what to do now. The only option is to leave the hero there, right? He can't just drag his headless body out of the alley. Not only would it catch the worst kind of attention from civilians, but he'd be arrested on the spot. And that still left the matter of 𝗳𝗍. If Izuku leaves the hero here, he can still get 𝗳𝗍 out, and that's all that matters. He did this all for 𝗳𝗍. He wasn't going to leave without him. Briefly, the thought crossed Izuku's mind that maybe this isn't normal. Killing a pro hero for a man you met just a week or two ago isn't normal. And yet, if the time came, Izuku would make the same decision once again. Picking himself up on wobbly legs, Izuku walked past the body lying on the ground, deciding it was in his best interest to just ignore it. And then he paused. The hatchet has his name written all over it. His fingerprints must be all over the handle, and probably even the blade. He can't just leave it there. The body will be found eventually, and so will the hatchet. It won't take police long to lead it back to him. Biting his lip till he tasted iron on his tongue, changed direction. It's fine, he doesn't have to look too closely. All he has to do is reach for his hatchet. And then he's done. Looking anywhere but at the severed head, Izuku bent down and reached for where he knew the hatchet fell. He let out a sigh of relief when his fingers ghosted along the handle, then confidently wrapped them around it. Unfortunately, the hatchet was drenched with blood, which transferred onto Izuku's hand when he grabbed it. Cringing, Izuku wiped it against the front of his hoodie. It was getting thrown out anyways, so might as well. He then tucked it back into his waistband, needing both his hands now. Stalking his way over to 𝗳𝗍, Izuku assessed his injuries. From where he watched, 𝗳𝗍 didn't seem to have gotten any external injuries aside from the stab wound, but the knife likely didn't hit anything vital, so he should be okay, until he somehow manages to get them back to the apartment. As long as the knife somehow dislodges itself, then they'll have a problem. He doesn't have a flashlight to check 𝗳𝗍's eyes, but he's pretty sure he has a concussion. It doesn't take a genius to put that together. Up till now, 𝗳𝗍 has just been sitting cross-legged against the brick holding his head in his hand, staring into his lap. Concerned, Izuku lifted his head by his chin, finding that 𝗳𝗍 shut his eyes. Shit. Flicking his forehead gently, Izuku whispered to 𝗳𝗍, hey, wake up. You can't go to sleep just yet, okay? One more wave of relief hit Izuku when 𝗳𝗍 blearily cracked open his eyes, wincing away from the street light. It seemed like he wanted to say something, but couldn't get it out. Don't close your eyes again, Izuku commanded. He couldn't keep stopping to check if 𝗳𝗍 fell asleep or not, so he'll just hope he heeds Izuku's warning. Standing back up, Izuku hooked his arms under 𝗳𝗍's, dragging him out of the alley. Now he just needs to figure out how in the world he's gonna get them back. He expected something like this would happen. Usually, the way it would go is exchange information, agree to meet up at an enclosed area, such as an apartment or a warehouse, and do business. Simple and easy. The enclosed area rule was created just a few months ago when a rather unfortunate incident happened, and it worked in his favor. Today was a special circumstance, an infrequent one that would not be happening again. The guy, Axel, had come up to him just a few days prior practically on his knees begging for 𝗳𝗍's help. He hadn't even considered the guy worth his time until he pulled out a hefty wad of cash. His attention was caught. The help that Axel needed was so painfully mediocre that 𝗳𝗍 wondered why he even needed it. You can keep yourself hidden, right? I really need this favor, man. There's this guy, and I really need someone to watch him for me. I can't do it myself though. Do you think you could watch him for a couple days and then report back to me? I have money, he had pleaded. 𝗳𝗍 almost felt bad. Almost, eyeing the man up and down. 𝗳𝗍 whirled around his drink in the small shot glass that was given to him, giving the impression that he had to think about it. He didn't. Money can get you a lot from 𝗳𝗍 if you have enough of it. He agreed to the man, of course, and they exchanged numbers. His work number, never his personal number. As they exchanged numbers, Axel also provided him with the address of the man he was to follow. If he was to be believed, the man lived alone, and was usually home around between 7 in the evening and 6 in the morning. He didn't stick around for long after that. Leaving his glass on the bar for the bartenders to take, 𝗵𝗲 went home. He'd been assured that he'd be paid in full after he gave Axel any information he got, and then he'd be done. He'd watch the guy for a couple days, meet up with Axel, get his money, and leave. He only hesitated when Axel texted him the next day, letting him know where they'd be meeting after 𝗵𝗲 did his job. Pulling up Google Maps on his phone, 𝗵𝗲 input the address into the search bar, frowning when it brought him to the middle of some random neighborhood had never heard of. "What's got you making that face?" Turn that frown upside down. 𝗵𝗲 looked up from his phone, finding Izuku in the kitchen making himself a sugar butter sandwich. His frown deepened. Leave it to Izuku to come up with some weird combo that's supposedly delicious. Izuku just continued insisting that it's a delicacy, and he just wouldn't understand. Izuku rolled his eyes at 𝗵𝗲's deeper frown, moving to the fridge to grab what he's sure will be his Diet Coke. He doesn't understand why he won't just get his own drinks, because he somehow just always manages to drink the last bottle and forget to tell 𝗵𝗲. So when he goes to the fridge expecting to find the drink he's been craving all day, he finds nothing in its place. Popping off the cap, Izuku walked over to the couch 𝗵𝗲 was currently occupying, kicking a dirty shirt under it in the process. Holding his bottle in a way where it wouldn't spill over, Izuku plopped down onto the cushion next to 𝗵𝗲, swinging his feet over the other's lap. "Does it have to do with your secret spy job? If it does, do tell. And if it's not, tell me anyway. I'm dying of boredom." He then took a bite out of his disgustingly sweet sandwich, talking around the food. "You know, I wouldn't be a bad spy. I think I'd be rather good. On the contrary, I could totally help you, like a secret spy duo. And we could go on super secret spy missions together, and maybe even work with other secret spies." Izuku was cut off. "If you say secret spy one more time, I'm going to take that sandwich, hide it somewhere in this house, let it get old and mold till it physically can't anymore, and then blend it into a smoothie for you to drink, unaware of what's really in it." Not bothering to check Izuku's reaction, he turned back to his phone, rereading the text again. He should reply with, "Sorry, no can do," which is what he'd normally say in this situation. But then he was reminded of the stack of yen the man presented to him. Narrowing his eyes, 𝗵𝗲 sighed. He needed a second opinion. Shutting off his phone and placing it on his side not occupied by an Izuku-shaped lump, 𝗵𝗲 folded his hands over the legs on his lap. He'd rather not ask Izuku for his opinion on something like this, but desperate times call for desperate measures. Pinching the bridge of his nose, 𝗵𝗲 slowly questioned, hypothetically, because Izuku would make a big deal out of this if it was anything but, would you go out of your comfort zone if it were for a good amount of cash? Vague. But he doesn't want Izuku asking too many questions. Izuku hummed around his food, before washing it down with 𝗵𝗲's soda. "I suppose if it really were for a good amount of money, I'd do it. It's not like I could afford to pass up an offer like that, even if it meant I'd have to do something I wouldn't normally do. And that makes sense, sure, but maybe he should raise the stakes. After all, he doesn't do meetings in public spaces for a reason. What if it meant risking your safety?" At that, Izuku put down his plate and his drink, pondering the question a little more seriously. "Well, how much money are we talking about?" He shifted, getting more comfortable in his spot. "I'm willing to risk my safety for the right amount of money. But like, a generous amount. Not just any small bit of money." He crossed his arms, awaiting the answer. It wouldn't hurt to give him a range, 𝗵𝗲 supposes. About 200,000 yen, he guessed. He's not totally sure, but from the bills he'd seen in the stack, his guess shouldn't be too far off. 𝗵𝗲 cringed when Izuku started choking on the small bite of his sandwich he'd managed to take while 𝗵𝗲 made his estimate. Finally, the teen managed to swallow his food, but not without small crumbs of bread falling out his mouth. "Gross, 200,000. Just how hypothetical is this?" Izuku cried. "Hypothetical enough. Answer the question." "Well, that's a whole lot of money. I think I'd risk it. You know how many chocolate croissants you could buy with that much money?" So typical of Izuku to make everything about his snacks. Though, he did keep his answer in mind. He had a point, in a sense. As a matter of fact, there's a possibility that nothing might even happen. He'd been considering this from the perspective of something definitely going wrong. But that's not even guaranteed. Before he'd stopped doing public meetups, he'd had a bunch of successful exchanges. Perhaps he's putting too much thought into this. Maybe he should just agree and get along with this, because the quicker he gets this guy's info, the quicker he gets the money, and that's the only thing he's worried about. The only thing he should be worried about. He can protect himself, if worse comes to worst. He was blessed with such a quirk for a reason. Picking his phone back up from where he'd tucked it under his leg, he opened up his messages with Axel, confirming the meetup. He definitely wouldn't be going back to public meetups even if this goes well. This was only an exception. That's all it was. Starting tomorrow, 𝗵𝗲 would be stalking some guy he doesn't even know the name of, and in 3 days, he'd have 200,000 yen in his pocket. He's stressing over absolutely nothing. And yet, the sinking feeling of regret that's pulling in his chest is only getting deeper and deeper, like a heavy anchor he couldn't seem to reel back in. All he knows when he regains consciousness is pain. Hot, unrelenting, excruciating pain. He can barely manage to crack open his eyes. And when he does, he shuts them again without a second of delay. What the fuck? He can barely even register where the pain is even coming from, blinded by the sheer intensity of it. He has so many questions, and yet he doesn't think he'd be able to ask them aloud to get the answers. Where is he and what happened? Last thing he remembers is the meeting. That's right, he was supposed to be meeting up with Axel tonight. Surely he made it to his destination, so what happened after that? After he made it, he can't think straight. Wait, is he moving right now? Abruptly, the bubble separating him from the rest of the world popped, and he could feel the coarse concrete being dragged out from under him. Or, no, that's not right. He's being dragged. Who the hell is dragging him? Preparing himself for the pain that would come along with his decisions, 𝗵𝗲 peeked open his right eye, the left following. The first thing he noticed was the blurriness that casted a curtain over his vision. He couldn't see shit. He could tell that it was still night time, at the least. He hasn't been out for too long. It seemed he hadn't made it too far from the original meeting spot either, because he recognizes this alley. He passed through it earlier, which still leaves the question. Who's dragging him? 𝗵𝗲's head lolled to the side, aiming to catch a glimpse of his mysterious captor. When he was blinded by a streetlight that's shining way brighter than it should have been, he winced away, sucking in air through his teeth. Ouch! The body behind him faltered, before continuing to drag him. You're awake. Please don't pass out again. You scared the fuck out of me. Seriously, Izuku. That's right. Izuku was here. He didn't miss the way the boy's voice quivered, or the way he tightened his grip on 𝗵𝗲's arms, to the point where he could almost feel the pain over the pain in other parts of his body. Which was, where? He thinks he can remember now. He'd gone to the meetup spot Axel requested, and Axel showed up. But he'd shown up without money, with absolutely nothing. And somehow, he still had the nerve to ask 𝗵𝗲 for the information, even after wasting his time. Like hell he'd be doing shit for free. And so he'd said no. That's all, he just refused Axel's demands. Because that's practically what they were, and told him to never request his help again. You can't depend on someone to live up to their promises a second time if they didn't the first time. Then, Axel pulled out a fucking gun, of all things. He could have laughed. He clearly wasn't familiar with how to handle a gun. By the way he gripped it. Not to mention the way his hand trembled. And so 𝗵𝗲 didn't hesitate to activate his quirk. Fuck around and find out, right? Things start to get a bit fuzzy around here. He can't exactly remember what happened to Axel, but he can infer. And then a hero showed up. Because of course a hero would show up, which is exactly why he doesn't do public meetings anymore. He didn't recognize the hero. Not that he'd recognize any hero that wasn't in the top 50 ranking. He honestly couldn't care less about heroes, unlike Izuku. Crap, wait, Izuku. He's talking, what's he saying? Has he been talking this entire time? And I don't know where the fuck I'm going. And you keep fucking passing out, and someone's bound to see me dragging you around soon. And you're literally bleeding out, I don't know that the fuck to do, and I can't stop saying fuck. What the fuck, 𝗵𝗲? Wow, okay. There's a bit to unpack there. He's bleeding out. That's probably why he's in so much pain then. Where's he bleeding from? Where'd the wound come from? The harder he thinks about it, the more pressure builds in his head, so he'll leave that alone for now. That's something to worry about later. Izuku also mentioned he didn't know where he was going, which makes sense, honestly. 𝗵𝗲 had needed to use directions off his phone to get to where he was going, with all the turns making it a bit confusing. He'd managed it though, in the end, thanks to the directions he followed. Did Izuku not realize he could search up directions? It's not hard, you just input your destination. But there's no way Izuku couldn't have pieced that together. Izuku is smart, smarter than he'd like to admit. Directions would be the first thing he thought to search up, even in a situation as stressful as this. This bears the question as to why he's actually not searching for directions. As much as he'd like to figure it out on his own right now, he physically can't think too hard for too long, or his head might explode. Instead, he twists around his arm in Izuku's hold, trying to wiggle his way out. Thankfully, bless his soul, Izuku gets the hint and hesitantly lets go of 𝗵𝗲's arm. Immediately, he begins patting around his pockets and finds what he was looking for. Pulling his phone out of his pocket with trembling fingers, he brought it up to his face to unlock it. Honestly, he's not sure how the facial recognition worked, but he couldn't be any more grateful. Not bothering to open up the app, 𝗵𝗲 held out the phone for Izuku to take. Once the phone was taken from his hands, the arm holding 𝗵𝗲's own hooked itself under 𝗵𝗲's arm, so that he could still use the phone while keeping 𝗵𝗲 in his hold. Oh my god, Izuku breathed, no way. You're actually a lifesaver. How does this happen every time? Oh look, I've been going the right way this whole time. We're a bit far, but as long as I keep you out of view from the streets we should be fine. It says here that 𝗍𝗲 stopped listening here. It wasn't on purpose, truthfully. He just couldn't comprehend the words being spoken to him anymore. It all sounded so far away. And he thinks that the bubble that separated him from the rest of the world might be back. Sighing, 𝗍𝗲 let his eyes fall shut. Izuku knew what he was doing, which meant everything would be fine and he could take a short nap.